Part 10 of Astounding Stories, January 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories, January 1930. The Stolen Mind by M. L. Staley. What caused you to answer our advertisement? Owen Quest felt the steel of the quick gray eyes that jabbed like gimlets across the office table. Why does any man apply for a job? He bristled. Keen Clayson gave an impatient smile. Come, he said, I'm not trying to snare you, but there were unusual features to my ad, and they were put there to attract an unusual type of man. To judge your qualifications, I must know just why this proposition appeals to you. I can tell you that, nodded Quest, but there's nothing unusual about it. In the first place, I knew that Clayson Research Corporation is the leading concern of its kind in the country. In the second place, this seemed to offer a way to obtain a substantial sum of money quickly. Good, said Clayson. And you feel that you have all the necessary qualifications? Decidedly. I am 24 years old, athletic, and of an earnest and determined nature. Moreover, I have no family ties, and I am willing to run any reasonable risk in order to improve the condition of my fellow men. Clayson smiled his approval. You say you need money. How much immediately? Quest was unprepared for the question. $1,000, he ventured. Without hesitation, Clayson counted out 10 $100 notes from his wallet and laid them on the table. There's your advanced fee. You ready to go to work immediately, I hope? Certainly, stammered Quest. Stunned by the swiftness of the transaction, he sat staring at the money that lay untouched before him. To accept it would be like signing an unread contract, but he had asked for it. To refuse it was impossible. Even to delay about picking it up might arouse Clayson's suspicion. Already the latter had turned away and was opening the door of a steel cabinet. Quest had 1 second in which to reach a decision. He crammed the currency into his pocket. With delicate care, Clayson set 2 objects on the table. One looked to Quest like a miniature broadcasting tower or a mooring mast for lighter-than-air craft. The other was a circular vat of some black material, probably carbon. Within it, a series of concentric tissues were suspended from metal rings, and in a trough outside ranged 4 stoppered flasks containing liquids of as many different colors. Look at these models carefully, said Clayson. They represent 2 of the most remarkable discoveries of all time. The one on your left is the most destructive weapon known to man. The other I consider the most constructive discovery in the history of science. It may even lead to an understanding of the nature of life and of the future of the spirit after death. Both of these were developed by my brother Philip and me together, but we have disagreed about the use to which they shall be put. Philip, the inventor dropped his voice to a whisper, wants to sell the secret of the death projector, the tower there, as an instrument of war. If I should permit him to do that, it might lead to the destruction of whole nations. How? Demanded Quest. I've heard of a device called the death ray. Is this it? No, no, said Clayson contemptuously. Even in a perfected state, the ray would be a child's toy compared to the projector. This is based on our discovery that invisible light rays of a certain wavelength, if highly concentrated, destroy life, and our additional discovery that if these are synchronized with short radio waves, the effect is absolutely devastating. We obtain the desired concentration of invisible light by using a tellurium current filter under the influence of alternate flashes of red and blue light. The projector can literally blanket vast areas with death, up to a top range of at least 500 miles. Just picture to yourself what this means. In a space of 10 minutes, 2 men can lay down a circle of destruction 1,000 miles in diameter, or they can cut a swath 500 miles long in any desired direction. Have you ever proved it? Demanded Quest skeptically. Yes, young man, we have, snapped Clayson. Right here in the laboratory, but on a minute scale, of course. However, there's no time to demonstrate now. The point is that my brother is determined to sell if he can obtain his price for the invention. He argues that instead of bringing disaster upon the world, this machine will forever discourage war by making it too terrible for any civilized nation to consider. In spite of my opposition, he has opened negotiations with an ambitious Balkan power. He may actually close the sale at any moment. However, Clayson drew a deep breath. You see this other device? Simple as it appears, it is the key to the whole situation. We can use it, you and I, to overcome Philip's will and prevent this unthinkable transaction. The two of us can do it. Alone, I would be virtually helpless. Why not have the projector confiscated or destroyed by our own government? Suggested Quest. That seems to me the only safe and sure way out of the difficulty. You simply do not understand, frowned Clayson impatiently. Philip is selling the plans and descriptions of the machine, not the machine itself. Even if this model and the larger test machine that we have built were destroyed, even if I were willing to have Philip sent to Leavenworth for life, he could still sell the projector. But this other invention, our osmotic liberator, makes it possible for me to gain control of Philip and actually change his mind through the medium of an agent. I have hired you to act as my agent, Quest, because I can see that you are a young man of unusual character and vitality, and by way of reward I can promise you both money and a brilliant future." The inventor poised in a tense attitude on the edge of his chair, as though his body were charged with electricity. His eyes seemed to dart out emanations that set Quest's blood to tingling. Then for a moment the latter lost consciousness of his physical self. It was as though he had opened a door and found himself suddenly on the brink of a new and totally strange world. He dispelled this fancy by a quick effort of the will, for he knew that he had a delicate problem on his hands, and that it must be solved within a very few minutes. However he proceeded, he must act without disloyalty to his government, and at the same time without injustice to Keane Clayson. "Tell me," he said in a husky voice, "how do you intend to use me? I do not believe in spiritualism. I would be a poor medium." Clayson gave a short laugh. "You are not to be a medium in that sense at all. Spiritualism, as practiced, is just a blind sort of groping and hoping. Osmotic liberation, on the other hand, is an exact and opposite physico-chemical science. Here, I will show you." In the outer cell of the Liberator he emptied the purple vial, and so on to the innermost, which he filled with a golden-green liquid like old chartreuse. The separating membranes, you understand, are permeable by these complicated solutions. Each liquid has a different osmotic pressure, and therefore should, under normal conditions, interchange with the others through the membranes until all pressures are equalized. I prevent such interchange, however, by maintaining an anti-electrolysis which retards ionization and thus builds up what might be called osmotic potential. Now if an agent, yourself for instance, submerges himself in the central cell, at the same time maintaining a physical contact with his control at the surface of the liquid, and if then the osmotic potential is suddenly released by throwing the electrolytic switch, the host of ions thus turned loose in the outer compartments make one grand rush for the central solution which contains the cathode. Under these conditions your body becomes a sort of sixth cell, and your skin another membrane in the series. Properly speaking, however, you are not a part of the electrolytic circuit, but are merely present in the action. Your body acts as a catalyzer, hastening the chemical action without itself being affected in any way. Physically, you undergo no change whatever, but in some strange way which is, like life, beyond analysis, your mind flows out into the solution, while your unaltered body remains at the bottom of the tank in a state of suspended animation. If no control is present, all that is needed to return your mind into your body is a throw of the electrolytic switch back to negative, whereupon you emerge from the tank exactly as you entered it. But with your control present, and in contact with your submerged body, your mind, instead of remaining suspended in the solution, flows instantly into his body and resides there subject to his will. This cannot be done, however, unless the wills of control and agent have first been brought into accord. To accomplish that, we clasp hands, Quest grasped Clayson's extended hand, and looked steadily into each other's eyes. Now it is well known that the vibrations of an individual's will are as distinctive as the swirls of his fingerprints. What is not so well known is that the frequency of vibration in one person can be brought into accord with that in another. You consciously retract your will by concentrating your mind upon the thing which you know I wish to accomplish. Gradually, while we continue in this position, your vibrations speed up or slow down until they acquire exactly the same frequency as my own. We are then in accord, and when your mind is liberated in the tank, it is in a state which admits absorption into my body. And it is subject to my will because you have purposely attuned it to my peculiar frequency. Immediately after the transfer, there will be a brief conflict due to the instinctive desire of your will to obtain the ascendancy. But of course, mine will gain the upper hand at once, since both wills will be in my frequency. Quest felt, rather than saw, a wall of alarm closing in on him. He tried to avert his eyes, to withdraw his hand from Clayson's grasp. With a nostalgic pang in the pit of his stomach, he suddenly realized that he could not do so. He had gone too far, farther than any man in his position had a right to go. Having deliberately weakened his will, it seemed now to have deserted him entirely. A prickling sensation coursed up his spine, his extended arm went numb, his hand trembled violently. "Splendid," said Clayson, suddenly releasing both eye and hand. "Just as I foresaw, you will be able to attune yourself to my vibration frequency with hardly an effort. Now please remain seated. I'll be back in a moment." For a second after the door closed, Quest remained slumped in his chair. Then he was on his feet, shaking himself like a wet dog to free himself from the spell under which he had fallen. Something about Clayson attracted and at the same time repelled him, fraying his nerves like an irritant drug and confusing his mind at the moment when he needed the full alertness of every faculty. Invisible light, disembodied minds, will vibrations? Nothing there to get hold of. Were these things real or imaginary? Was Keene Clayson a great inventor or a madman? Would Philip prove to be a real or an imaginary scoundrel? Should he summon help or go on alone? Professional pride said, "Wait. Don't be an alarmist." With his knuckles, Quest tapped the table, half expecting it to melt under his fingers. The feeling and sound of the contact gave him a peculiar start. On the farther end of the table stood a letter box, an invitation. From his pocket Quest snatched a slip of paper and wrote, 6-4, 945A. Hired. If no report in 48 hours, clamp down hard. To address a stamped envelope and slip it in with the outgoing mail was the work of seconds. But he was none too quick. He had just dropped back into a lounging attitude when the door burst open and Clayson flew into the room. "We must act instantly," hissed the inventor. "Philip plans to close the transaction within a day." In spite of himself, Quest jumped upright in his chair. Clayson tapped him on the shoulder reassuringly. "It's all right," he smiled. "I'm ready for him. We'll make our move this afternoon and beat him by 18 hours. Let's see." He paused. "Oh yes, I was about to explain to you that as soon as the will of the agent enters the body of his control, the latter can again transfer it into the body of still another person. Now you understand why I advertise for a man of exceptional character. As my agent, I want you to enter the body of Philip, and your will must be strong enough to conquer his in the battle for mastery which will begin the instant you intrude into his body. You will still be under my control, but your will must be strong enough on its own merits to overcome his. I can direct you, but your strength must be your own. That's clear, isn't it?" "I think so," said Quest slowly. "But what becomes of me after you have frustrated Philip's plot?" "That's the easy part of the process," smiled Clayson. "But naturally you feel some anxiety about it. I simply withdraw your will from Philip, return it to your own body, and pay you a reward of $10,000. You're sure you can?" "Perfectly. I have merely to touch Philip's hand to recapture your will. Then I immerse myself in the tank with a switch at plus. The osmotic action will extract both wills momentarily from my body. But the presence of two bodies and two wills in the solution together forces a balance, and each will seeks out and enters its own body. Then you and I climb out of the tank exactly as we are this minute." "If it weren't for my belief that anything is possible," Quest shook his head, I'd say that your claims for this invention were ridiculous." "And you couldn't be blamed," admitted Clayson readily. "This toy of a model is hardly convincing. But come along with me, and I'll show you how the Liberator looks in actual operation." The office rug concealed a trap door, which gave upon a spiral stair. Below, Clayson unlocked another door, and led the way through a narrow and tremendously long passage, lighted at intervals by small electric bulbs. Presently, another door yielded to the inventor's deft touch, and closed behind them with a portentous chug. Here the darkness was so utter and intense that Quest imagined he could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. From the slope of the passageway, and the muffled beat of machinery that had come to his ears on the way along, he guessed that he was below ground in some chamber at the rear of the factory. He gave a low exclamation as Clayson switched on the top light. No wonder the darkness had seemed of an almost supernatural quality. Even the hard white glare of the daylight arc was grisly. Its rays rebounded from the liquids of the great circular tank in a blinding dazzle of color, while the dull black walls and ceiling were so perfectly absorptive that beyond arm's length they became to all effects invisible. Even the ledge on which he stood, the shoulder of the vat, gave Quest the feeling that to move would be to step off into a bottomless pit. But Clayson took his attention at once, pointing here and there in his quick, nervous way to indicate how faithfully the Liberator had been reproduced from the model. In all respects the arrangements were the same, with the addition that here a long plank, like a springboard, extended out from a wall mount as far as the central compartment of the tank, and that from its end a narrow ladder hung down to the surface of the chartreuse liquid. A double throw switch fixed to the wall above the base of the plank was evidently the source of the electrolytic control. "When you throw the switch to plus," said Clayson, pointing to the chalk-marked sign above, "you produce the violent electrolytic action needed to bring about a liberation. All the rest of the time it should be closed at minus in order to maintain the anti-action which I explained to you. Now let's rehearse, so that when the time for the real performance arrives, we can be sure of running it off without a hitch." "All right, sir," nodded Quest, so dazed by the glittering light that he was hardly conscious of what he said. "First," said Clayson, running lightly up the steps to the plank, "you walk out to the end, like this, and start down the ladder. Then you lower yourself into the tank. The liquid is at body temperature. It's neither strongly acid nor caustic. It will cause you no injury or discomfort whatever. Meanwhile, I keep in contact with your hand until the instant that you become submerged. Now your mind is in me, see? Ready for transfer into Philip, where it will act as my agent. That's how simple it is. Come on up and we'll go through the motions." Quest experienced a shiver as he mounted the bridge. Annoyed with himself, he shrugged the feeling off. There was no risk here. Moreover, it was part of his daily work to take chances. He had done so 100 times without hesitation. Now he moved all the more quickly, as if to belie the squeamishness that possessed him in spite of himself. Swinging past Clayson on the plank, he lowered himself without a pause to the bottom rung of the ladder, while the inventor, hanging head down, maintained contact with him. "No need to stay here," he said in sudden irritation. "I understand perfectly what I am to do." "I'm testing my own acrobatic ability," grunted Clayson amiably. "Just a minute now." He wriggled as if trying to adjust himself to a better balance, but in reality to mask the motion of his free hand with which he reached up and pressed a button in the side of the plank. Instantly the structure, pivoting downward on its wall socket, plunged Quest to the waist in the osmotic solution. "For God's sake, get out of the way!" he shouted, trying to wrench his hand out of Clayson's sinewy grip. "Let go, I tell you!" But Clayson clung like a leech, his teeth gritted under the strain. Again the plank lurched downward, and with a violent splash, Quest vanished below the surface. Quick as a cat, Clayson scrambled up the ladder and back to the base of the plank, where he erased and interchanged the chalk-marked signs with which he had misled Quest. Then, with a sinister twist of a smile, he threw the switch to minus, and turned to watch as the plank slowly righted itself and the vacant ladder came clear of the liquid. For some time he stood staring at the gleaming colored rings of the dissociation vat like some witch over her cauldron, his lips working, his hands clasping and unclasping like the tentacles of some sub-sea monster. Then, as if the spell had suddenly broken, he turned on his heel and switched off the light. As he hastened down the passageway towards his office, the airlock sucked the door against its jamb with an ominous whistle. In a twinkling, as Quest's shackled spirit writhed in its new housing, he knew that he was in bondage to a scoundrel. Formless and voiceless, he still fought madly for the freedom which the instinct of 10,000 generations made necessary to him. At the same time, he was furious at himself for having been tricked like an innocent schoolboy. The plank socket, the button which had tripped the supporting spring, the fake rehearsal, the turning of his will to that of Clayson, step by step, the whole cunning scheme unfolded itself to him now. But what could be the purpose behind this villainy? Only one answer seemed possible. Keane must be the one bent on selling the death projector, Philip the one who wished to frustrate this fiendish transaction. And Quest of the Secret Service, he was to be the tool to force the sale. With a soundless scream of rage, Quest's will hurled itself against Keane's. The two met like infuriated bulls, and for an instant, too brief to be pictured as a lapse of time, they poised immovable. But two wills cannot exist on equal terms in a single body, and in this case the vibration of both was that of Clayson. Quest had challenged the master will, he could do no more. It hurled him back, crushed him like foam, compressed him to the proportions of an atom in the background of his consciousness. So brief and unequal was the conflict that in the next breath Clayson had all but forgotten the presence of the stolen will within him. When he was ready to use his agent, that would be time enough to summon him. Despite this suppression, Quest began to see dimly through strange eyes, and to hear vaguely with ears that were not his own. Feelers, tentacles, some intangible kind of conduits carried thought impulses to him from the master will. He received these impressions vividly, but those which he gave off in return were so weak, due to the subjection of his will, that Clayson was entirely unconscious of any response. Quest was not enough of a scientist to be astonished at the ability of a disembodied mind to experience sense impressions in the body of another. He was only glad that the darkness and silence were growing less. Very, very slowly he was awakening to a new kind of consciousness, the consciousness of another person's self. He hated and loathed that self, yet it was better than the awful blankness that had gone before. Suddenly, as light grew brighter and sound more clear and definite, a new element entered, the element of hope. At first it was feeble. Its only suggestion was that sometime, somehow, he might escape this prison. But it was like water to a parched plant. It caused his will to expand, to extend its feelers, to press up a little more bravely against the crushing pile of the master will. Now another surprise sprang upon him. He was moving. That is, Clayson's body was moving in some kind of conveyance, which was threading its way through crowded streets. Stores, buildings, buses, people. Quest remembered them all distantly as things he had known thousands of years ago. The driver turned his head, and his profile seemed vaguely familiar. Now a rush of foreign thoughts drowned out his own. They were a sort of overflow from the mind of Clayson. They thronged along the conduits that bound the two wills together, but only Quest was conscious of the movement. Keane's mind was on his brother Philip. That much was particularly clear. And there was something about a phone call. Yes, Keane had telephoned to the police, disguising his voice, refusing to divulge his name. He had said that a man by the name of Philip Clayson was in trouble, and had told them where to find him. Then the police had telephoned the factory, and Keane had pretended astonishment and alarm at the news. That's why he was here now. He was on the way to confer with the police. And he was chuckling because he had fooled Quest and the police, and because now the $100 million was almost in his grasp. Cutting in close, the car turned a corner and drew up before one of a row of loft buildings in a section of town which Quest failed to recognize. As Clayson stepped to the sidewalk, Quest was more painfully aware than ever of his powerlessness to influence by so much as the twitch of a muscle the behavior of this hostile body in which he had permitted himself to be trapped. In his weakness he felt himself shrinking, contracting almost to nothingness under the careless pressure of the master will. Clayson glanced casually at his watch, and 3 men converged toward him from as many directions. There was nothing to distinguish them from anyone else in the street, but along the conduits it came to Quest that they were detectives and that they were there by appointment with Keene Clayson. "What floor?" asked the latter, with an excitement which Quest felt instantly was pure pretense. "Are you sure they haven't spirited him away?" "Don't worry," replied the leader of the detectives. "The alley and roof are covered. We'll take care of the rest ourselves." On tiptoe they climbed 3 long flights of stairs in the half-light. Clayson held back, as if in fear. He was a good actor, and Quest felt the shrinking and hesitation of his body as he crouched and slunk along in the wake of the detectives, pretending terror at what was about to happen, though he knew, and Quest knew he knew, that there would be no resistance up there, that Philip would be found alone exactly as he had been left by Keene's hired thugs. On the top landing, Burke, the leader, paused to count the doors from front to rear. "This is it," he whispered to the bull-necked fellow just behind him. The other nodded and crouched back against the opposite wall while his companions placed themselves in position to cross-fire into the room the moment the door gave way. Quest longed for the power to kick his hypocrite of a master as he still held back, cowering on the stairs, playing his fake to the limit. Then the door flew in with a splintering shriek under the charge of the human battering ram, and across it hurtled the other 2 detectives in a cloud of ancient dust. "Here he is!" someone shouted. "Phil! Phil!" Keene Clayson's voice fairly quavered with sham emotion as he ran into the room and threw himself at the man tightly bound to an upholstered chair, which in turn was wedged in among other articles of stored furniture. But Philip was too securely gagged to reply, and as Burke slashed the ropes from across his chest, he dropped forward in a state of collapse. Stretched on a couch, he soon gave signs of response as a brisk massage began to restore the circulation to his cramped limbs. Suddenly he sat up and thrust his rescuers aside. "What time is it?" he demanded with an air of alarm. 1 o'clock, replied Keene before anyone else could answer, patting his brother affectionately on the shoulder, while within him Quest writhed with indignation. "By Jove, Phil, it's wonderful that we got to you in time. Really, you're not injured?" "No," grunted Philip, "just lamed up. I'll be as fit as ever by tomorrow." "If you feel equal to it," suggested Burke, "I wish you'd tell me briefly how you arrived here. Do you know the motive behind this affair? Did you recognize any of the body snatchers?" Philip frowned and shook his head. "Yesterday noon," he said slowly, "I took the 8-passenger Airline Express to Cleveland on business. There were 3 other passengers in the cabin, 2 men and a woman. Right away I got out a correspondence file and was running over some letters. The next thing I knew I was approaching the ground in the strangest state of mind I ever experienced. My head was splitting, and everything looked unreal to me. Seemed as if I was coming down on some new planet." "You mean the ship was gliding down to land?" "No, no. I was dangling from a parachute. By the way, where am I now?" "In a Munson Avenue loft." "In Chicago?" Burke nodded. "I guessed as much," frowned Philip. "You see, I came down in a field, and then before I could free myself from my trappings I was pounced on, trussed up and blindfolded, by a gang of men. I knew they had taken me a long distance by automobile, but I saw nothing more until they tore the blindfold from my eyes when they left me here." "And they were all strangers to you?" "Yes, those that I saw." "Isn't this enough for just now, Burke?" interrupted Keene, and Quest received an impression of uneasiness that was not apparent in the inventor's tone. After a good rest he's sure to recall things that escape him now. "Just 1 minute," nodded the detective, turning back to Philip. "Can you think of no plausible reason for this attack? Is there no one who might possibly benefit by putting you temporarily out of the way?" Philip gave a frightened start. Then he was on his feet, clutching at his brother's arm. "Keene," he pleaded. "Keene, what's happened? I know, it's the projector." "Water!" roared Keene, and Quest felt the panic that coursed through him as he tried to drown out his brother. "Somebody bring water! He needs it!" At the same time he snatched up Philip's hand in a grip of steel. Instantly the latter's wild eyes became calm, The flush passed from his relaxing face, and he slumped down weakly on the couch. In that fleeting moment, Quest surged into the body of Philip, and confronted his will with a fierce and triumphant ardor. For now his will would have command of a body with which to fight his fiend of a control. With a sensation of contempt, he met Philip's resistance and buffeted him ruthlessly backwards, crushed down and compressed his feebly struggling will. And as Philip yielded, Quest felt his own will expanding to normal, taking possession of the borrowed body with a hungry greed, and flashing from its faded eyes the spark of youth. Burke stared in amazement at the kaleidoscopic rapidity of the changes in the rescued man's expression. Strange lights and shadows continued to flit across Philip's face as Quest's invasion of him proceeded, but with a diminishing frequency which soon assured Keane that his agent was tightening his command. The younger of Burke's aides stood fascinated, his mouth agape. The other spoke guardedly to his superior. "Dope, eh?" "Nah," replied Burke, shrugging himself out of his trance. "Shock." The actual duration of the conflict in Philip was something less than 3 seconds. It would have been more brief if Quest had exerted himself to the utmost. But his sensations as he first surged into this new habitat under Keane's propulsion were so weird and unearthly that for the moment he was lost in the wonder of the experience. For that short time, therefore, Philip was able to fight back against the onrush of the invading will. In the next second, Quest became conscious of the resistance. Urged on by his control, he must push Philip back and quell him. But his sympathy for his opponent and his hatred of Keane roused him to sudden revolt. He wanted to disobey the master will, retreat, leaving Philip in command of himself. But he could only go on, unwillingly thrusting back Philip's will despite the indescribable torment and confusion in his own. Then, with the feeling that he was 10 times worse than the most inhuman ghoul, he took full possession of his borrowed body. "I'll take him home now," said Keane composedly to Burke. "As you see, he needs a little extra sleep. Meanwhile, if you have any occasion to call me, I will be at the factory." To the youthful mind of the agent, used to the lightness of an athletic physique, the body in which it moved down the stairs to the limousine seemed strangely heavy and awkward. "I'm badly done up, Keane," he said with Philip's lips as the car got under way. "Bah!" snorted Keane. "You've had a scare, that's all. Go to bed when you get home, and sleep till 9 this evening. At 10 a man named Dr. Nakarin will call for you. He will drive you to a garage, leave the car, and transfer to another one a few blocks away. Out near Marbleton you will find an airplane staked in an open field. Nakarin is a capable pilot. He will fly back southeast along the lake shore to the meeting place. You should arrive about 12:30. The test is set for 1 o'clock. Quest listened in a state of abject rage. Lacking the power to resist his control, he could only boil away in Philip's body like a wild creature hemmed in by bars of steel. "Bring with you," continued Keane venomously, "the set of papers that you took from the safe in my office. Hold the other set in readiness to deliver to Nakarin tomorrow, after he has studied the results of the test and has notified Paris to release $100 million in cash for delivery at your Loop office at 3 p.m. The murderous greed of the man maddened Quest. He tried to revolt, his will squirming like a physical thing, threshing the ether like a wounded shark in the sea. For a moment he felt that he was about to burst the bonds that his demon of a control had woven around him. So violently did he resist that the immured and spore-like will of Philip forged up fitfully out of the blackness and joined him in the hopeless struggle. But along the attenuated conduits that still chained Quest to the master will, Keane caught the impulse of the mutiny, and his eyes darted flame as he countered with a will shock that paralyzed his unruly agent. "Listen, you whimpering dog," he snarled. "Think as I tell you and nothing more. You are going to apologize to Dr. Nakarin for your previous unwillingness to sell the projector. You are going to tell him that I am at fault, that I held out, but that you found a way to force my compliance. You understand?" Quest could find no words. With Philip's head, he nodded meekly. Just then the car stopped, and the chauffeur threw open the door. Dr. Nakarin flew high despite the masses of cumulus cloud which frequently reduced visibility to zero. He had merely to follow the rim of the lake to his destination, and an occasional glimpse of the water was sufficient to hold him on his course. In the back seat hunched Philip, his body crumbling under the weight of Quest's despair. For hours the latter had gone on vaguely, hoping somehow to thwart this horrible transaction that was rushing the world to its doom, thinking he might grow strong enough to wrench himself free and so liberate Philip from the dominance of his conscienceless brother. Even though such a move should leave his own will forever separate from his body, he was ready and anxious to make the sacrifice. Suddenly the crash of the motor ceased, and Nukharin banked the ship up in a spiral glide. Quest had never been in the air before, and the long whirl down into the darkness on this devil's errand was to him as eerie as a ride to perdition in a white-hot projectile. His mind seemed to trail out in a great nebular helix behind the descending ship. He felt that he had suddenly crossed some cosmic meridian into a new plane of existence, where he was changed to a gas, yet continued capable of thought. But even here his obsession remained the same. Keane Clayson, trickster, traitor arch-criminal, must be destroyed. "I'll get him," vowed Quest, in words that were no less real for being soundless. "I'll trail him to the end of space and bring him to account." Then wheels touched earth, and the cold bare facts of his destiny rushed in on him with redoubled force. He felt the nearness of his control seconds before he perceived him through the eyes of Philip. With a sensation like a stab, he realized that now he must speak, play his part, be any bloodless hypocrite that Keane Clayson chose to make him. The silent order surged down the conduits promptly enough. He responded as an automaton obeys the pressure of a button. "Here, Doctor," chuckled Philip with a cunning leer. "Here's the magic tower, just as I promised you. We'll run it up in a jiffy. This test is going to be so vivid and conclusive that not even a hard-headed skeptic like you can raise a question." "You misunderstand me," returned Nukharin in an injured tone. "So far as I am concerned, this procedure is only a formality. But it is none the less necessary. Suppose that I should spend 100 million of my government's money and the purchase prove worthless. You may guess that my folly would cost me dear." Keane Clayson was waiting on the platform of a great truck, the motor of which was idling. All the apparatus was in readiness except that the 3 demountable sections of the tower had yet to be run up into position. "One of the beauties of the D.P.," said Philip gleefully to the doctor, while Keane smiled slyly to himself, "is that this pint-sized dynamo provides all the current needed for the test. We picked the power for our radio right out of the air by means of a wave trap and mensurator invented by this bright little brother of mine," and he clapped Keane patronizingly on the back. "Ah, yes, Dr. Nukharin?" ventured Keane timidly, and at that moment Quest experienced the raging red hatred that causes men to murder. "Philip has promised me that you will employ this device only as a threat to hold the ambitions of the larger powers in check." Of course," replied the doctor heartily. "But now let's have the test. Even at night I'm not too fond of these open-air performances." The height of the tower, as they ran the upper sections into place, was 40 feet. When all connections had been inspected, first by Keane, then by Philip, the former led Nukharin aloft. As the climax of his plot approached, Keane's excitement bordered on a cataleptic state, hints of which came confusedly through the conduits to Quest. With a peculiar satisfaction, he felt that Keane was suffering. The inventor's jaws had become rigid, as though his blood had changed to liquid air and frozen him, and he had difficulty in controlling the movements of his arms. Now he was afraid, genuinely afraid this time. Quest caught the impulse too clearly to doubt its meaning. This was no sham. Keane was doubting his own machine, fearing that in the crisis some element in the finely calculated mechanism might fail to operate, thus cheating him of the blood money on which his heart was set. Then he was speaking, and even Nukharin noticed the tremor in his voice. "These 9 tubes, which look like a row of gun barrels, are molded from silicon paste. Each shoots a beam of invisible light and a radio dart of precisely the same wavelength. The destructive effect depends chiefly upon this exactness of synchronization." "A question occurs to me," said the doctor. Will others be able to manipulate the machine as successfully as you can?" "It's foolproof," chattered Keene, almost losing control of his voice. "Absolutely foolproof. Surely you have scientists in your country who can follow written directions. Nothing more is necessary." "Very well," shrugged Nukharin. "I only want to be sure that no unforeseen difficulties may arise in an emergency." "See this range setter?" continued Keene. "The thread on the vertical shaft enables us not only to limit the range by angling the beams into the ground, but it can also be disengaged and the projector revolves in a flat circle for maximum ranges." "And is there no danger of the machine going wrong, of destroying itself and us?" suggested Nukharin. "None whatever, Doctor. There is no explosive force and no great electrical voltage involved. As long as we stand back of the muzzles we have nothing to fear. Now look, I have set the micrometer at 300 yards, which will just about cover the stretch between ourselves and the lake. I will cut a swath for you, and every bush, every blade of grass, every insect in this swath will be withered to ash in the twinkling of an eye. The destruction will be absolute." "Please proceed," said Nukharin grimly. Keene pulled a lever in its slot, then pressed it down into its lock as his projection battery swung lakeward at the desired angle. Then with one hand poised on another lever, he pressed an electric button. At the controls below, a bulb flashed on and off. The signal was superfluous, for already Quest had received the silent command from his master will. An icy dread fastened on him. He must obey the unspoken command. He had no will of his own with which to resist. The test would be a success, the projector would be sold, the world would be turned into a shambles. And he, Owen Quest, would be the destroyer, the murderer, the weak fool who made this horror possible. All this flashed through the agent's mind in the fraction of a second that it took him to extend Philip's hand, close the switch of the dynamo, and snap on the alternating lights in the housing over the tellurium filter. For an interminable 5 seconds he waited, in a ferment of revolt which the paralysis of his will made it impossible to put into action. Then again the command pulsed within him, the signal bulb flashed, and he reversed his motions of the moment before. Cold sweat cascaded down Philip's face as Quest felt the ladder vibrating under descending feet. He longed for the power to hurl Keene Clason to the ground and turn the projector upon him. But with an awful irony, the master will forced him to his feet, and to speak in a tone that withered the manhood within him. "Come," said Philip, in a triumphant tone to Nukharin, "and I will show you that Clason inventions perform as well as they sound." Flashlight in hand, he started toward the lake with Nukharin and his brother close behind him. 20 paces, and the long meadow grass suddenly vanished from beneath their feet. "See that?" whispered Philip excitedly, waving the light from side to side to show the 40-foot swath that stretched away before them. Not a trace of life left, not a blade of grass, nothing but dust. The only response was a gurgling sound that issued from Nukharin's throat. "Look!" Quest formed the word with Philip's lips under the urge of the master will. "Here was a tall bush. What do you see now? Just a teaspoonful of ash. When you examine the remains by daylight, you will find that even the root has disintegrated to a depth of 2 feet. "Enough of this!" croaked Nukharin in horror. "The deal is closed." His face was convulsed with fear. Without another word he whirled about and fled towards his airplane. Philip gave a start as if to follow. "Halt, you slob!" growled Keene, whose composure had returned with the successful outcome of the test. "I have use for your company, even though you are as great a coward as our Slavic friend." Coward! The epithet stung Quest like a flaming goad. One of the fine intangible lines that bound him under the will of Keene Clason severed, and his own will exploded into action like a thunderbolt. With startling agility he whirled Philip about, the flashlight clubbed in his hand. But Keene was quicker still. A clip on the wrist sent the weapon flying. Then Philip reeled backward from a kick in the stomach, and his clutching hands beat the air as he sank unconscious in the dust. With a violent tug, Quest lifted Philip's body to a sitting position. The phone was ringing, and by the pull on the will fibers he knew that Keene was at the other end of the wire. Philip's body was falling under the strain of the part it was forced to play, and the blow of the night before had further weakened it. Now he sat rocking his head painfully between his hands. But Quest lifted him to his feet by sheer will, and he staggered across the room. "Hello," he said in a hoarse voice. "Get the hell out of here to the factory," rasped Keene, and the crash of the receiver emphasized the command. It was 1 o'clock as Philip whirled his sedan into Olmsted Avenue. At 3, reflected Quest as the car scorched over the pavements, he must be at the downtown office to deliver the papers and receive the money. Then he was face to face with Keene, reeling dizzily at the hatred that blazed from the latter's accusing eyes. "Double-crossed me, eh?" The voice was a low snarl, and as he spoke, Keene thumped the extra outspread on his desk. "But you're not going to get away with it, neither of you." Dismay, hope, dread, wonder robbed Quest of the power to speak. But he whirled around behind the desk with such unexpected violence that Keene staggered back in alarm. Then he was devouring the screaming headlines of the newspaper. 3 seconds, like a slow exposure, and every word of the Record's great scoop was etched upon his mind as if with caustic. Doom launched adrift on lake. Physician baffled by condition of 5 bodies found in craft. Blighted area on shore said to have bearing on tragedy. Thaw Harbor, Indiana, June 6. 5 Chicago sportsmen, most of them prominent in business and society, perished in the early hours this morning while returning in the launch of A. Gaston Andrews from a weekend camping party near Hook Split on the Michigan shore. The boat was towed into this port at daybreak by the interlake tug Mordecai after being found adrift less than a mile offshore. According to Captain Goff of the Mordecai, the death craft carried no lights and he barely avoided running her down. The weather along the Indiana shore was perfect throughout the night, and there is nothing to indicate that the launch was in trouble at any time. The bodies are unmarked, and this little community is agog with rumors ranging all the way from murder and suicide to the supernatural. Dr. J. M. Addis of Thaw Harbor, the first physician to examine the bodies, says that they appear to have suffered some violent electrochemical action, the nature of which cannot be determined at the moment. This statement is considered significant in view of the reported discovery ashore of a large blighted area almost directly opposite the point where the launch was found. Joseph Sleichart, a farmer who lives in that vicinity, reports that this patch of ground extending back from the lake shore was completely stripped of vegetation overnight. He ascribes the damage to some unknown insect pest. Others say that the condition of the ground indicates that it has been burned at incinerator temperatures. Nothing is left of the soil but a blue powder. Philip faced his brother with eyes that were dull with agony. "You have made me a murderer!" Quest forced out the words in painful gasps. But Keene snapped back at him like a rabid dog. "You did it! You did it yourself! You tampered with the projector! You tried to spoil the test! You changed the range! You tried to kill me, and instead you killed these others! And you're going to pay, both of you! You hear me? You're going to pay!" His voice mounted the scale to a scream. It was a wail of unreasoning terror, the dread of exposure, of the fear that he would fail to collect the fortune now so nearly in his grasp. The accident that had jarred his well-laid plans had unnerved him. Frantically Quest strove to answer him, to explain his utter subjection as agent, to say that if he had possessed the will to oppose or trick him he would have turned him over to the police, or might even have killed him at the very outset. But in his frenzy, Keene had so tightened his control that Quest was speechless. Now he tried to substitute gesture for words, but Philip was rooted to the spot like a statue. Even his hands were immovable. He might have remained in this state indefinitely had not Keene's fears withdrawn his mind from his immediate surroundings. Momentarily he forgot Quest, Philip, everything but himself and his predicament. And in the instant that his vigilance relaxed, Quest's enslaved will experienced a sudden lease of strength and hope. Independently of his control, he found that he could move Philip's hands, could take a faltering step. But now what to do? How might he fan this feeble spark of volition to sufficient strength for decisive resistance? The idea came to him. If only he could place distance between himself and Keene, Perhaps with one titanic effort he might launch himself against the master will, take him by surprise, crush him down, and reverse him to the status of agent instead of control. With infinite effort, Quest forced Philip's body step by step across the room. He must reach that window, get a signal of distress to someone in the street. But Keene began to sense a mutiny. He followed. He crossed the floor with slinking tigerish steps and snaking body. His wet lips writhed back over his teeth, and his contorted features wove the leer of the abyss. Now, as his control drew physically near, Quest felt his might of strength ebbing fast. Slowly Keene reached up with his clawed fingers and grasped the agent by the arm. "Remember," he hissed, "if these deaths are traced to us, you break down, you confess, you take the blame. You paint me lily white. You describe the cowardly means by which you molded me to your will. You plead only for a quick trial and the full penalty of the law. You understand?" Quest made no reply, but he understood all too well the hideous intention of his betrayer. What a fool he had been to imagine that Keene Clason would ever restore him to his body. Philip to the chair, Quest a homeless spirit wandering in space, and for the body at the bottom of the tank, the brief regrets of the department. A sudden rushing sound filled the air with a sense of action and alarm. 2, 3, 4 speeding automobiles swung in recklessly to the curb and shrieked to a standstill under smoking brakes. Men leaped out and deployed on the run to surround the factory. Keene darted to the door and twisted the key. "Come on!" he spat at Philip as he snatched back the rug and threw open the trap door. The command galvanized Quest to action. In 2 bounds he had Philip on the stairs. A heavy impact rattled the office door just as he dropped the trap into place over his head. Then, infected with Keene's panic, he was running down the passageway like mad. Inside the tank chamber, the brilliantly colored rings of liquid flashed back the rays of the arc light. Half crazed with anxiety, Keene danced on the black ledge like a monkey on a griddle. His face was ashen. Drool ran from his twisted mouth. His eyes were 2 black pools of terror. Again Quest experienced the peculiar sensation which came with the slackening of control. New hope sprang up in his agonized being as heavy blows boomed against the airlock door. Great waves of fear poured along the conduits, betraying to the agent the state of mind of his control. Now what would Keene do? What could he do? Why, of all places, had he fled down into this blind burrow? Thud! Thud! There came a series of sharp reports. Outside they were trying to shoot away the deep-sunk disc hinges. Still the door stood fast, but the fury of the assault on it whipped the faltering Keene to action. In a bound he was on the platform. With a lightning hand he threw the switch to plus, starting electrolytic action in the tank. Then he pressed a button concealed under the edge of the switch mount, and a panel slid silently aside in the wall, revealing a narrow outlet. To Quest everything went a flaming red. He might have known that this fox would have something in reserve, a way of escape when danger threatened. But his control gave him no time for independent thought. He forced Quest to turn Philip's eyes up to his own. Without disconnecting that grip of his glittering eyes, Keene leapt back to the ledge. Quest felt the silent order. "Get up on the plank. Dive into the tank. Get back into your own body. Let Philip have his. Then come up, the 2 of you, and face the music. For I'll be gone, and your story will sound like the ravings of a maniac." Quest took an obedient step towards the platform, but at the same instant a tremendous crash shivered the door. It seemed to unnerve Keene Clason. With a gasp he sank down upon the steps, his body doubled in pain, his hand clutching at his heart. Another crash followed, and he shuddered and cried out. Instantly Quest felt an expansion of the will. Keene's sudden physical weakness had loosened his control. Philip's lips worked painfully as Quest forced him to pause, to disobey the command of the master will. In a spasm of will he fought to wrench himself free from the countless clinging tentacles of his control. In great surges, Quest's reviving volition pounded against the walls of his borrowed body. Now he sought to force this sluggish body back to the wall, so that he might release the airlock and spring the door. But Philip seemed to ossify. every cord and muscle of his body frozen to stone by the conflict that raged within him. Braced against the wall, Keene was rising slowly to his feet. His seizure was easing, and so he was able to exert a better pressure upon his rebellious agent. "Come!" he gasped, realizing that he lacked the strength to escape alone, and must therefore change his plan. "Lift me, quick! Carry me out! Slide the panel back into place. We will escape together." The spoken command turned the balance against Quest. His will yielded to the master. At the same instant Philip's body relaxed like an object relieved of a great excess of electrical potential. Suddenly strong and supple, he lifted the trembling Keene and tossed him across his shoulder. For a moment there had been a lull in the assault on the door. Now the battering resumed with a fury that jarred the whole chamber and sent ripples dancing across the vari-colored liquids in the osmotic tank. "Quick!" gasped Keene. "Move, I say! Carry me out!" But he was in a fainting condition. Crash after crash rocked the chamber, and with every blow Quest's will felt a stimulation that enabled him to stand off the commands of his control. Then a wave of nausea swept over him and left him reeling. It seemed that Philip's blood had turned to boiling oil. A dazzling mist swallowed him up, and with a weird sensation of inflation he felt full strength returning to his will. A booming blow that bulged the door inward acted upon him like a stage player's cue. He leaped to the platform. The gurgling sound of remonstrance rattled from Keene's throat, but Quest paid no heed. Philip was walking the plank, away from the open panel and out over the tank. Rapidly he dropped down the ladder to the bottom rung, snatched Keene's wrist in a gorilla-like grip, and hurled him down into the vat. Then Philip was clinging desperately to the ladder, his strength gone, his body shivering as if with ague. "Go on up," came a strange, impatient voice from below him. "For heaven's sake, let me out of here." A downward glance, and with a shout of alarm Philip was scrambling up the ladder, for there was a head down there, and a pair of naked shoulders, and the face of a man he had never seen before. Hand over hand, Quest followed. Philip had collapsed and lay prone on the plank. Quest lifted him to his feet and shook him anxiously. "Philip," he urged. "Philip, can you walk?" The tattoo on the battered door helped to revive the older man. "Quick," whispered Quest, kneading Philip's arms. "There's barely an hour left. Get to your office, burn the papers, refuse the money, do you hear me?" Philip nodded dazedly. "Hurry," puffed Quest, thrusting him through the opening that Keene had reserved for his own escape and sliding the panel back into place. Quest was himself now, young, strong, free. Instantly he threw the electrolytic switch to minus, for Keene had failed to emerge from the tank, and since he was submerged alone, he could not escape until electrolysis was halted. Just as Quest leaped from the platform to release the airlock, the door burst in, and 3 men with drawn guns rushed into the chamber. The leader stopped with a startled oath and stood blinking his unbelieving eyes. Quest was poised like a statue, his naked body gleaming unearthly white against the lustreless black of the wall. "Quest!" came from the 3 in chorus. Then a rush of questions. "What's the matter? What happened to you? Where are the Claysons?" Quest turned toward the platform, expecting to see Keene. "Something's wrong," he shouted. "Quick! Somebody get Philip. He's gone to his loop office. Keene Clayson's at the bottom of this tank. I'm not sure how this thing works, but Philip can get him out, I'm sure of it." Despite the confident predictions of both Quest and Philip Clayson, osmotic association failed to restore Keene to life, and at last a coroner ordered the removal of the body. The autopsy revealed heart disease as the cause of his death. For reasons best understood at Washington, the cause of the 5 launch deaths was withheld from the public. Quest's punishment for his part in the crime consisted of a promotion and a warm personal letter from the President of the United States. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Alan Winterrowd. Audio.boomcoach.com.
Part 11 of Astounding Stories, January 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories, January 1930. Chapter 11. Why, John! Involuntarily, I halted at the entrance to my snug bachelor quarters as the flood of light my turning of the switch produced revealed a huddled figure, slumped in an easy chair. "Aye, sir, 'tis me." The man got to his feet, gnarled, hands rubbing at his eyes. "And 'tis all day that I've been waiting for you, sir. The caretaker said you'd be back soon, so let me in. I must have fell asleep, and no wonder, what with the strain and no sleep or rest all last night." Strain? No rest? I stared my bewilderment, trying at the same time to conceal the vague apprehensions occasioned by the fact that the trusted servitor of my friend, Professor Roxton, should wait all day for me. Hastily shedding my outer things, I bade him again be seated, sat down facing him, and asked him to explain. "'Tis the professor, sir." The old chap peered at me with anxious, wrinkled eyes. "'Tis common enough for him to send me here on messages, sir, but today I've come on my own, because, sir," answered the question in my eyes, "I haven't seen sight of him since last night." "Why?" I began. "That's just it, sir." John took the words out of my mouth. "For 20 years my wife and me have looked after the professor at the Grange. In all that time he's never been away at night. Whenever he had to come to town, he'd tell us. Most times I'd drive him myself in the old car, but that was very seldom, sir, for Professor Roxton had few interests outside." "But, John," I protested, "is there no other reason for your agitation? He might have had an urgent call, or gone out for a walk or a drive by himself." "No, sir. If you'll pardon me, sir, you're wrong. The professor was fixed in his habits. He would not go away without telling me. Think back, sir. You know the professor as well as me. Better, because you are his friend, and I am only a servant. Although, sir," this proudly, "he always treated me as a friend." "Go on," I urged, seeing he was not finished. "Well, sir, a few minutes back you asked me if there was no other reason for my being upset like this. There is, sir. You know, sir, that for more than 20 years the professor has led a retired sort of life, the life of a recluse," I suggested. "That's it, sir. He only left the Grange when he had to. He was all wrapped up in some weird-like thing he was inventing. In all those years, sir, you were the only visitor who ever went into his laboratory or stayed at the Grange for a night or more. That is, sir, until 3 days ago." "Go on," I urged again, some of his perturbation communicating itself to me. "The Grange, sir, lying as it does 15 miles from town and back in its own grounds away from the road, isn't noted by many. When strangers do get into the grounds, I usually gets 'em out again in short order. 3 days ago, sir, a stranger drove up to the door in a fine car. He told me he was wanting to purchase a country home. I told him the Grange was not for sale and turned him away. He was turning his car to leave when my master came out. To my surprise, sir, he invited the stranger in. And I'm sure, sir, because he looked so taken aback like, that the stranger had never seen the professor before." "And after that?" I asked, now feeling decidedly uneasy. "The stranger, sir, a Mr. Latham he called himself, stayed on. He was in the study with the master last night. This morning there was no trace of either of them." "But, good God, John!" I jerked to my feet, a fresh dread clutching at my heart. "What are you trying to get at? The professor and Mr. Latham might possibly have driven away somewhere last night." "Both cars, sir," the servant answered, "are in the garage. I bolt all the doors in the house myself every night. They were still fastened this morning, and my wife and me searched the house from cellar to garret and hunted all over the grounds. But we couldn't find a trace of the master or his guest." "Do you mean to suggest, then," I shot at him, "that 2 full-grown men have completely vanished? It's absurd, John, absurd." I paced the floor, thinking desperately for a few minutes, conscious of the ancient's anxious eyes. I half smiled. The thing was too ridiculous for anything. Old John had grown morbid from living away from the outer world. Also, I had to admit that the atmosphere of the Grange, impregnated as it was with the lethal scientific dabblings of my friend, was exactly suited to the conjuring up of unhealthy forebodings in uneducated minds. I'd drive out to the home of my friend at once. No doubt I'd find him fit and well. He had refused to install a phone, so drive it had to be. "John!" I stopped my pacing and patted him on the shoulder. "I'm coming out to the Grange at once." His face showed a thankfulness. "I am sure," I went on as I struggled into my coat, "that we shall find the professor and his guest awaiting us. Anyway, it's time you got back to your wife and had some food." "I hope to heaven, sir, that you're right." With that, we left the building and entered my car. Although I had tried to dispel my fears, although I had tried to banter John out of his dread, I drove that evening as I had never driven before or since. Barely 15 minutes later, I halted my roadster at the short flight of steps leading to the main door of the Grange. Even as we stepped from the machine, the door flung open, and an agitated woman hurried towards us. She was Mary, John's wife. "Sir," she gripped my arm and stared anxiously into my face, "'tis glad I am that you've come. The Grange is a house of death." In spite of myself, a chill shook my whole body. Gently handing her to John, I strode up the steps. At the open doorway, I halted, the aged couple crowding on my heels, the woman still babbling about death. I couldn't blame her. All day she had been alone in that gloomy, rambling old building, wondering, no doubt, why John and I had not returned sooner. And gloomy the house was. Always, even when staying there at the professor's request, I had found it to be somber and depressing, as if there lurked within its walls the shadowy wings of the years-old tragedy that had caused my friend to retire to such a God-forsaken place, and there become absorbed in his scientific experiments. Even now, as I gazed into the dimly lit hallway, the air seemed charged with that same malignant something I cannot describe. Pulling myself together, I strode quickly along the corridor and flung open the study door. The lights being full on, one glance sufficed to show me that my friend was not there. Swinging on my heel, the horror I saw in the eyes of the servants, honest, healthy folks not easily frightened, conveyed itself to me. Somehow the sight of that room, lights on, chairs drawn up to the burnt-out fire, brought home to me the fact that something serious was amiss. I chided myself for thinking John had been unduly agitated. For a moment I stood, trying to conceal the chill coursing through my veins. Puzzling what to do next, I decided to search the house thoroughly. If I found no sign of the professor or his guest, I would call in the police. Fearfully, yet willingly, the aged couple led me from room to room, from attic to basement, until but one place remained, the laboratory. I hesitated for several seconds at the closed door of my friend's workroom. Not that I had never entered the, to a layman's eyes, weirdly appointed place. I had been in many times with the professor. But this time, I dreaded what I might find. Pulling myself together, I gently tried the door. To my horror, it yielded to my touch. Alive, the professor always kept it locked. A new dread assailed me as, flinging the door wide open, I blinked in the sudden glare of powerful globes. Someone had left the lights full on. Horrified, I stood and stared, knowing by their heavy breathing that the aged couple were also staring with fright-widened eyes. Afraid of what? I did not know. I only knew that the atmosphere had become even more sinister. I knew that something dreadful had taken place in that room. Trembling with consternation, I forced myself to take a few steps forward. Then I again stared about me. At one end of the large room, something shone brightly in the glow of the lights. Slowly, I walked across to examine it. It appeared to be a glass case, almost like a showcase, about 8 feet square and 7 feet in height. With the mechanical actions of the mentally distraught, I walked all around it. Not the slightest sign of an entrance could I see. The fact intrigued me. I tapped lightly on the highly polished surface with my fingers. It rang to my touch like cut glass. Through the transparent surface, I could see John and his wife. They were watching me furtively, wondering, no doubt, why I lingered. As I looked at them, John suddenly lumbered up to the case on the opposite side. Dropping to his knees, he stared. Turning an imploring gaze to me, he pointed, his lips moving soundlessly. I followed the pointing finger with my eyes, gasped at what I saw. Near the center of the cage, on the floor, constructed of the same crystalline substance, something glittered, its brilliance almost dazzling as the light rays struck it. My face pressed close to the cold outer surface of the structure. My shocked intelligence gradually realized what the small, sparkling object was. It was a magnificent diamond, and the professor had always worn a diamond ring. In a sudden frenzy of horror, I pawed my way around the cage to where John still knelt. As I reached him, he jerked his head in a numb way as he croaked, "It's a diamond, sir. The professor's." "But how?" I implored. "How can it be? There's no way into this thing. Perhaps he was working here, and the stone came loose from its setting. He couldn't have dropped it after the cage was completed." "It's his diamond, sir," intoned the old man dully. "I know it is." Then a sudden, unreasoning terror filled me. I shrank away from that shining box. It seemed to be mocking me, gloatingly, malevolently. "Quickly," I threw at the aged couple. "Let us get out of here, now, at once." They needed no second urging. I knew that they felt as I felt. The laboratory was a sepulchre. 5 minutes later, I was guiding my car over the narrow road to town. I did not pause until I drew up at police headquarters. I suppose my appearance was distraught, for I was ushered into the presence of the chief without delay. In a few moments I had poured out my story. He listened with a polite calmness I found almost maddening. Leaning back in his chair, he reviewed, audibly, the facts. "Some 20-odd years ago, your friend, Professor Roxton, married. He was so absorbed in the pursuit of some weird invention that he neglected his bride. She ran away with another man. This man deserted her and disappeared. The professor found her many months later in desperate health, and shortly afterwards she died. Your friend tried to trail the man, but failed. Shocked and saddened beyond measure, he retired to a place known as the Grange." He suddenly straightened up in his seat and pointed at me with a thick forefinger. "How long have you known Professor Roxton?" "About 10 years," I answered. "What was he trying to invent?" "I don't know," I replied. "And yet you had his confidence in other matters." "But what has all this to do with finding out what has become of my friend?" I blurted out. "Perhaps every moment counts." "A lot." The chief eyed me in a way I did not like. "Solely because your friend has not been seen by his servants for nearly 24 hours, merely because you saw what you believed to be his diamond in some kind of a glass compartment in his laboratory, you have come here as distraught as a man who has something terrible on his mind. Why?" "I can't say." I shifted uneasily under that direct stare. "Somehow I feel that something dreadful has happened to my friend." "We do not go by feelings." The chief got to his feet. "But you have told me enough to warrant action. I want you to guide me and a couple of men to this house. Please wait here until I return." He left the room. Sitting there awaiting his return, I tried to ponder the matter reasonably. After all, perhaps the chief was right. Merely because the professor had been absent for a few hours, and I had seen what I thought to be his diamond in the laboratory, I had worked myself into a perfect fever of anxiety. I almost smiled to myself. In that business-like office, the whole affair did seem absurd. After all, the professor did not have to answer to his servants for his actions. Heavy footsteps announcing the chief's return caused me to rise to my feet. A few minutes later, in company with the 3 officers, I was driving again towards the Grange. We made the return journey in almost complete silence. Occasionally, the chief would shoot a question at me, but the night air cooling my fevered brain, my replies were guarded. He realized that fact, for I felt his eyes upon me all the way. What was going on behind that broad forehead, I wondered. Then we reached the Grange. As we mounted the steps, John, his wife herding behind him, flung wide the door. He answered the question in my eyes with a negative shake of his head, and the words, "Nothing fresh, sir." The chief eyed him keenly, then curtly bade him lead the way to the laboratory. John hung back, his face blanched. "I can't, sir," he faltered. The chief turned to me, and although I wanted to follow John's example, although the atmosphere of the house had again filled me with an unshakable dread, I led the way, standing back at the door to allow the officers to enter first. With calculating gaze, the chief slowly took in every detail of the stone apartment. He turned to me. "What is there to be afraid of?" I pointed hesitatingly toward the crystalline cage. The chief and his men strode across to it. "You don't know how to open this?" the chief shot at me after a brief examination. "No," I replied. "It was not here on my last visit." "When was that?" "Some 2 or 3 months ago," I answered. "My work occasions much traveling on my part." The chief and his men turned again to the cage, talking in undertones. He turned again to me. "You notice that this thing is built in sections. One of them must be movable. Perhaps—" He paused as his eyes fell upon some wires and tubes that trailed across the floor from underneath the cage to a switchboard fastened to the wall. "Perhaps," he repeated, "it is worked from that board." He crossed over, stared thoughtfully at the shining levers for some seconds, and moved one slightly. The result was astounding. All 4 of us stared with unbelieving eyes as slowly, without the faintest sound, a section of one wall slid inwards, as if guided by invisible tracks on floor and ceiling. "Guess that's enough for now." With those words, the chief backed away almost timidly, I thought, from the switchboard and walked to the cage. For a moment he hesitated, but he entered and emerged with the sparkling object in his hand. "It's the professor's," I choked, crowding close to him. "How do you know?" he shot back. "All unset stones look pretty much alike." "I just know," was all I could falter. "You just know." The chief sat down on a stool and regarded me searchingly. "Mr. Thornton, when I started out with you, I thought I was on a wild goose chase or the trail of a confession. You looked exactly like a man who had either committed a serious crime or was getting over a bad drunk. I feel sure now," he again regarded the diamond, "that your story was not the product of an alcohol-crazed brain. Come on." He lurched to his feet and grasped me at the shoulder. "Come through." Without answering, I wrenched myself free. Over my shoulder, I saw one of the policemen at the door. In the hand of the other, a revolver suddenly appeared. Good God! I glared in bewilderment from one to another. Was I going mad? Surely this was some awful nightmare. What had I said to make them suspect me of having committed a revolting crime? "Sit down!" The command came from the chief. Mechanically, I found a stool and obeyed him. "Hold your stations, boys, and listen carefully," he ordered his men. Then he turned to me. "Professor Roxton was a wealthy man without kith or kin?" "Yes." "Did you know the nature of his will?" "Yes." Chilled to the heart, I felt the circumstantial net tightening. "What is its nature?" "This house and an annuity to John and his wife," I explained. "The residue of his wealth to me." "Humph!" The chief stared at me piercingly. "And how has business been with you lately?" Damn the man. What right had he to put me through the 3rd degree? I felt my state of dazed horror slowly giving way to anger. I glanced around. The pistol still menaced. The man at the door had not moved. It was useless to try and evade the questions. "For the past year," I replied, "business has been very poor. In fact, the professor advanced me some money." "Humph!" Again, that irritating, non-committal grunt. The chief turned in his seat and stared thoughtfully at the crystalline cage. "And you don't know what the professor was trying to invent?" "Only its nature," I began. "Ah, that's better. Why didn't you tell me that before?" The chief leaned forward. "Well," I explained, "the whole thing seems so absurd. When the professor told me how his married life had been broken up, he told me that at the time he reached the utmost depths of human suffering. Absolute zero, he called it." "Ah." "The experiments he indulged in," I continued, trying to hide the shiver pimpling my flesh, "were to produce an actual state of absolute zero. It is years since he told me this. I had almost forgotten it." "And exactly what is an absolute zero?" The chief's eyes never left mine. "Well," I protested, "please understand that I also am a layman in these matters. According to my friend, an absolute zero has been the dream of scientists for ages. Once upon a time it was attained, but the secret became lost." "And exactly what is absolute zero?" Curse the man. I could have struck him down for the chilling level of his tone. I forced myself to go on, realizing that I was damning myself at every step. "An absolute zero is a cold so intense it will destroy flesh, bone, and tissue. Remove them," my voice rose in spite of myself, "leaving absolutely no trace. No trace. Something attracted my eyes. The chief had opened his hand. The diamond there flashed and sparkled, as if mocking me. I pulled myself together and went on. It all comes back to me now. One day I came out here and found the professor terribly distraught. He told me that, with the aid of electric currents, he had been able to invent the absolute zero, but he could not invent a container. Why? Those eyes continued to bore into mine. Because, remember, it is years since he told me this, there was difficulty in controlling the power. Besides destroying living things, it would destroy bricks and mortar, stone and iron. Only one substance it could not wipe out: crystalline, of diamond hardness. I know now. I jumped to my feet and grabbed the chief's arm. I know now what he meant. Fool. Why did I not think of it before? This, I swung towards the cage, is compensation. Almost panting in my eagerness, I went on. My friend told me that the law of compensation would atone to him for the tragedy of his youth. Absolute zero in suffering would be atoned for by a real state of absolute zero. Chief, I whirled on him, don't you understand? This is the perfected dream of my friend. It is the absolute zero. Plausible, but not convincing. I slumped back at the officer's words. That does not explain the professor's disappearance. Even if it did, what about Mr. Latham? And don't forget, this contrivance is worked from outside. We found the diamond inside. Of course, he might have placed it there himself to test the machine, he concluded. Of course, that's it, I commenced. But I regretted the words when I saw suspicion flicker again in the chief's eyes. Lamely, I finished. And he has probably rushed off in an ecstasy of triumph to acquaint professional colleagues, without unlocking any doors or taking a car, eh? Mr. Thornton, the chief stood up and regarded me sternly. As a sensible man, don't you think yourself that your story is a bit thin? The professor has disappeared. Here is a strange-looking case which you say is an absolute zero container. Whether you know or are just jumping at conclusions remains to be proved, but even if it is, do you think that, after perfecting such a tremendous invention, the professor would commit suicide? On the contrary, I gasped. My friend was a man of gentle, kindly disposition, but strong purpose. I should think his first action on attaining his life's ambition would be to notify me, his closest friend. And he didn't. Every word condemned me and roused me to retaliate. Chief, I know enough of the law to know that before you can try a man for murder, you must prove that murder has been committed. I grinned savagely. You must have the corpus delicti. Go ahead. Find my friend or his remains, or else withdraw your charges. I grinned again with shocked mirthlessness. Then I buried my head in my hands. I had called in the police to help find the professor, and they had only blundered around and asked a lot of stupid questions. The chief had practically accused me of murder, something I knew he could not prove, yet feared he might. Because I had told the chief of the locked doors and unused cars, he had confined his investigations to the house itself. He interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Thornton, I'm going back to town. You will remain here with my men. I advise you to get some sleep, as I shall not be able to carry out certain investigations until the morning. One of my men will spend his time searching the house and patrolling the grounds. The other one will stay here with you. He turned away, whispered some instructions to his men, and, followed by one of them, silently left the laboratory. I started to protest, tried to follow him. The man at the door stopped me. Silently, almost grimly, he indicated a narrow cot at one end of the room. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling the man's eyes upon me. Sleep on my dead, I felt sure he was dead, friend's cot. Sleep in that fearful place. My whole being crawled with horror. I turned again to the man. His features were unyielding. Perhaps this was more third degree. Limp with weakness and weariness, I dragged my lagging feet towards the cot. As long as I live, I shall never forget my awakening. A uniformed figure, the chief, shaking me by the shoulder. Two other uniformed men silently watching. I sat up and gazed about me, dazedly. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows. A stray gleam struck the cage. I shrank back, trembling. And yet I had slept soundly. Mr. Thornton, the chief said, I have serious news for you. I have positive proof your friend is dead." "Dear God!" The exclamation was wrung from me as recollection returned with a rush. "Where? You can't have—" "Here." He thrust a bundle of letters into my hands. "You acted so strangely last night you caused me to suspect you of a serious crime. Also, you overlooked several important points. You got back from a trip only last night." Last night? Surely it was years. "You had left instructions to have your mail forwarded," the level voice went on. "These letters were evidently one day behind you. I picked them up at your rooms this morning. I took the liberty of opening them. Read this one." He selected it. With trembling fingers, I extracted from the envelope a single written page. I recognized the handwriting as the professor's. I read with feverish intensity, each single word burning itself into my consciousness. "Dear Thornton, I am writing this in anticipation. I will see that it is mailed when my plans are completed. Too late, dear friend, for you to attempt, with the best intentions in the world, to frustrate them. You will perhaps recall that many years ago, when I gave you my full confidence, I told you that I felt sure that the law of compensation would atone in some small measure for my loss. Thornton, old friend, I believe that in more ways than one, my hour has arrived. 2 days ago, I completed the absolute zero. But even better, a man called here today. Although he did not recognize me, I saw through the veneer of added years with ease. Fate, call it what you will, my visitor is the man who wrecked my happiness. Under pretext, I shall detain him. I shall induce him to enter the crystalline cage. I have already arranged a dual control which the power will destroy when I apply it from inside the cage. Please destroy the cage. It will have brought compensation to me before you read this. Goodbye, dear friend. Roxton. "I apologize, Mr. Thornton." The chief offered a hand, which I clutched in mingled sorrow and relief. The world had lost a genius. I had lost a dear friend. But he was right. It was compensation. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Jeff Machado.
Tanks by Murray Leinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Tanks. The deciding battle of the War of 1932 was the first in which the use of infantry was practically discontinued. History of the U.S., 1920 to 1945, Greg Harley. 2 miles of American front had gone dead, and on 2 lone infantrymen, lost in the menace of the fog gas and the tanks, depended the outcome of the War of 1932. The persistent, oily smell of fog gas was everywhere, even in the little pillbox. Outside, all the world was blotted out by the thick gray mist that went rolling slowly across the country with the breeze. The noises that came through it were curiously muted. Fog gas mutes all noises somewhat, but somewhere to the right artillery was pounding something with HE shell, and there were those little spitting undercurrent explosions that told of tanks in action. To the right there was a distant rolling of machine-gun fire. In between was an utter, solemn silence. Sergeant Coffey, disreputable to look at and disrespectful of mien, was sprawling over one of the gunner's seats and talking into a field telephone while mud dripped from him. Corporal Wallace, equally muddy and still more disreputable, was painstakingly manufacturing one complete cigarette from the pinched-out butts of 4 others. Both were rifle infantry. Neither had any right or reason to be occupying a definitely machine-gun section post. The fact that the machine-gun crew was all dead did not seem to make much difference to Sector HQ at the other end of the telephone wire, judging from the questions that were being asked. "I tell you," drawled Sergeant Coffee, "they're dead. Yeah, all dead. Just as dead as when I told you the first time, maybe even deader. Gas, of course. I don't know what kind. Yeah, they got their masks on." He waited, looking speculatively at the cigarette Corporal Wallis had in manufacture. It began to look imposing. Corporal Wallis regarded it affectionately. Sergeant Coffee put his hand over the mouthpiece and looked intently at his companion. "Give me a drag of that, Pete," he suggested. "I'll slip you some butts in a minute." Corporal Wallis nodded and proceeded to light the cigarette with infinite artistry. He puffed delicately upon it, inhaled it with the care a man learns when he has just so much tobacco and never expects to get any more, and reluctantly handed it to Sergeant Coffee. Sergeant Coffee emptied his lungs in a sigh of anticipation. He put the cigarette to his lips. It burned brightly as he drew upon it. Its tip became brighter and brighter until it was white-hot, and the paper crackled as the line of fire crept up the tube. "Hey," said Corporal Wallis in alarm. Sergeant Coffee waved him aside, and his chest expanded to the fullest limit of his blouse. When his lungs could hold no more, he ceased to draw, grandly returned about 1/4 of the cigarette to Corporal Wallis, and blew out a cloud of smoke in small driblets until he had to gasp for breath. "When you ain't got much time," said Sergeant Coffee amiably, "that's a quick smoke." Corporal Wallis regarded the ruins of his cigarette with a woeful air. "Hell," said Corporal Wallis gloomily, but he smoked what was left. "Yeah," said Sergeant Coffee suddenly into the field telephone. "I'm still here, and they're still dead. Listen, Mr. Officer, I got me a black eye and numerous contusions. Also, my gas mask is busted. I called you up to do you a favor. I aim to head for distant parts." "Hell's bells! Ain't there anybody else in the Army?" He stopped, and resentment died out in wide-eyed amazement. Yeah, yeah, I got you, Loot. All right, I'll see what I can do. Yeah, wish you'd see my insurance gets paid. Yeah." He hung up gloomily and turned to Corporal Wallis. "We got to be heroes," he announced bitterly. "Sit out here in the stinking fog and wait for a tank to come along and wipe us out. We're the only listening post in 2 miles of front. That new gas of theirs wiped out all the rest without report." He surveyed the crumpled figures, which had been the original occupants of the pillbox. They wore the same uniform as himself, and when he took the gas mask off one of them, the man's face was strangely peaceful. "Hell of a war," said Sergeant Coffee bitterly. "Here our gang gets wiped out by a helicopter. I ain't seen sunlight in a week, and I got just 4 butts left. Lucky I started saving 'em." He rummaged shrewdly. "This guy's got half a sack of Makins. Say, that was Lieutenant Madison on the line then. Transfer from our gang a couple of months back. They cut him in the line to listen in on me, make sure I was who I said I was. He recognized my voice." Corporal Wallis, after smoking to the last and ultimate puff, pinched out his cigarette and put the fragments of a butt back in his pocket. "What we got to do?" he asked, watching as Sergeant Coffee divided the treasure trove into 2 scrupulously exact portions. "Nothin'," said Coffee bitterly, "except find out how this gang got wiped out, and a few little things like that. Half the front line is in the air. The planes can't see anything, of course, and nobody dares cut the fog gas to look. He didn't say much, but he said for God's sake find out something." Corporal Wallis gloated over 1/4 of a sack of tobacco and stowed it away. "The infantry gets the dirty end of the stick," he said gloomily. "I'm going to roll me a whole one, pre-war, and smoke it presently." "Hell yes," said Coffee. He examined his gas mask from force of habit before stepping out into the fog once more, then contemptuously threw it aside. "Gas masks, hell. Ain't worth having. Come on." Corporal Wallis followed as he emerged from the little round cone of the pillbox. The gray mist that was fog gas hung over everything. There was a definite breeze blowing, but the mist was so dense that it did not seem to move. It was far enough from the fog flares for the least trace of striation to have vanished. 15 miles to the north, the fog flares were placed, ranged by hundreds and by thousands, burning one after another as the fog service set them off, and sending out their incredible masses of thick gray vapor in long threads that spread out before the wind, coalesced, and made a smoke-screen to which the puny efforts of the last war, the war that was to make the world safe for democracy, were as nothing. Here, 15 miles downwind from the flares, it was possible to see clearly in a circle approximately 5 feet in diameter. At the edge of that circle, outlines began to blur. At 10 feet, all shapes were the faintest of bulks, the dimmest of outlines. At 15 feet, all was invisible, hidden behind a screen of mist. "Cast around," said Coffee gloomily. "Maybe we'll find a shell, or tracks of a tank or something that chucked the gas here." It was rather ludicrous to go searching for anything in that mass of vapor. At 3 yards' distance they could make each other out as dim outlines, no more. But it did not even occur to them to deplore the mist. The war, which had already been christened by the politicians at home the last war, was always fought in a mist. The infantry could not stand against tanks. Tanks could not live under aircraft-directed artillery fire, not when 40 guns fired salvos for the aircraft to spot, and neither artillery nor aircraft could take any advantage of a victory which either, under special conditions, might win. The general staffs of both the United States and the prominent nation, let's say the Yellow Empire, at war with it, had come to a single conclusion. Tanks or infantry were needed for the use of victories. Infantry could be destroyed by tanks, but tanks could be hidden from aerial spotters by smoke screens. The result was fog gas, which was being used by both sides in the most modern fashion when, their own unit wiped out and themselves wandering aimlessly in the general direction of the American rear, Sergeant Coffee and Corporal Wallis stumbled upon an American pillbox with its small garrison lying dead. For 40 miles in one direction, and perhaps 30 in the other, the vapor lay upon the earth. It was being blown by the wind, of course, but it was sufficiently heavier than air to cling to the ground level, and the industries of 2 nations were straining every nerve to supply the demands of their respective armies for its material. The fog bank was nowhere less than 100 feet thick, a cloud of impalpable particles, impenetrable to any eye or any camera, however shrewdly filtered. And under that mattress of pale opacity, the tanks crawled heavily. They lurched and rumbled upon their deadly errands, uncouth and barbarous, listening for each other by a myriad of devices, locked in desperate, short-range conflict when they came upon each other, and emitting clouds of deadly vapor against which gas masks were no protection when they came upon opposing infantry. The infantrymen, though, were few. Their principal purpose was the reporting of the approach or passage of tanks, and trenches were of no service to them. They occupied unarmed little listening posts with field telephones, small wireless or ground buzzer sets for reporting the enemy before he overwhelmed them. They held small pillboxes, fitted with anti-tank guns, which sometimes, if rarely, managed to get home a shell, aimed largely by sound, before the tank rolled over gun and gunners alike. And now Sergeant Coffee and Corporal Wallis groped about in that blinding mist. There had been 2 systems of listening posts hidden in it, each of admittedly little fighting value, but each one deep and composed of an infinity of little pinpoint posts where 2 or 3 men were stationed. The American posts, by their reports, had assured the command that all enemy tanks were on the other side of a certain definite line. Their own tanks, receiving recognition signals, passed and repassed among them, prowling in quest of invaders. The enemy tanks crawled upon the same grisly patrol on their own side. But 2 miles of the American front had suddenly gone silent. 100 telephones had ceased to make reports along the line nearest the enemy. As Coffey and Wallace stumbled about the little pillbox, looking for some inkling of the way in which the original occupants of the small strong-point had been wiped out, the second line of observation posts began to go dead. Now one, now another abruptly ceased to communicate. Half a dozen were in actual conversation with their sector headquarters, and broke off between words. The wires remained intact. But in 15 nerve-wracking minutes, a second 100 posts ceased to make reports, and ceased to answer the inquiry signal. GHQ was demanding explanations in crisp accents that told the matter was being taken very seriously indeed. And then, as the officer in command of the second-line sector headquarters was explaining frenziedly that he was doing all any man could do, he stopped short between 2 words, and thereafter he also ceased to communicate. Front-line sector headquarters seemed inexplicably to have escaped whatever fate had overtaken all its posts, but it could only report that they had apparently gone out of existence without warning. American tanks, prowling in the area that had gone dead, announced that no enemy tanks had been seen. G-81, stumbling on a pillbox no more than 10 minutes after it had gone silent, offered to investigate. A member of her crew, in a gas mask, stepped out of the port doorway. Immediately thereafter, G-81's wireless reports stopped coming in. The situation was clearly shown in the huge tank that had been built to serve as GHQ. That tank was 70 feet long, and lay hidden in the mist with a brood of other, smaller tanks clustered near it, from each of which a cable ran to the telephones and instruments of the greater monster. Farther off, in the fog, of course, were other tanks, hundreds of them, fighting machines all, silent and motionless now, but infinitely ready to protect the brain of the army. The GHQ maneuver board showed the battle as no single observer could ever have seen it. A map lay spread out on a monster board, under a pitiless white light. It was a map of the whole battlefield. Tiny sparks crawled here and there under the map, and there were hundreds of little pins with different colored heads to mark the position of this thing and that. The crawling sparks were the reported positions of American tanks, made visible as positions of moving trains had been made visible for years on the electric charts of railroads in dispatchers' offices. Where the tiny bulbs glowed under the map, there a tank crawled under the fog. As the tank moved, the first bulb went out and another flashed into light. The general watched broodingly as the crawling sparks moved from this place to that place, as vari-colored lights flashed up and vanished, as a steady hand reached down to shift tiny pins and place new ones. The general moved rarely, and spoke hardly at all. His whole air was that of a man absorbed in a game of chess, a game on which the fate of a nation depended. He was thus absorbed. The great board, illuminated from above by the glaring bulb, and speckled with little white sparks from below by the tiny bulbs beneath, showed the situation clearly at every instant. The crawling white sparks were his own tanks, each in its present position. Flashing blue sparks noted the last report of enemy tanks. 2 staff officers stood behind the general, and each spoke from time to time into a strapped-on telephone transmitter. They were giving routine orders, heading the nearest American patrol tanks toward the location of the latest reported enemies. The general reached out his hand suddenly and marked off an area with his fingers. They were long fingers and slender ones, an artist's fingers. "Our outposts are dead in this space," he observed meditatively. The use of the word outposts dated him many years back as a soldier, back to the old days of open warfare, which had only now come about again. Penetration of 2 miles. "Tank, sir," said the man of the steady fingers, putting a black pin in position within that area. "Let a man out in a gas mask to examine a pillbox. The tank does not report or reply, sir." "Gas," said the general, noting the spot. "They're new gas, of course. It must go through masks or sag paste or both." He looked up to one of a row of officers seated opposite him, each man with headphones strapped to his ears and a transmitter before his lips, and each man with a map pad on his knees, on which, from time to time, he made notations and shifted pins absorbedly. "Captain Harvey," said the general, "you are sure that dead spot has not been bombarded with gas shells?" "Yes, General. There has been no artillery fire heavy enough to put more than a fraction of those posts out of action, and all that fire, sir, has been accounted for elsewhere." The officer looked up, saw the general's eyes shift, and bent to his map again, on which he was marking areas from which spotting aircraft reported flashes, as of heavy guns beneath the mist. "Their aircraft have not been dropping bombs, positively?" A second officer glanced up from his own map. "Our planes cover all that space, sir, and have for some time." "They either have a noiseless tank," observed the general meditatively, "or—" The steady fingers placed a red pin at a certain spot. "One observation post, sir, has reopened communication. 2 infantrymen, separated from their command, came upon it and found the machine-gun crew dead, with gas masks adjusted. No tanks or tracks. They are identified, sir, and are now looking for tank tracks or shells." The general nodded emotionlessly. "Let me know immediately." He fell back to the ceaseless study of the board, with its crawling sparks and sudden flashes of light. Over at the left, there were 4 white sparks crawling toward a spot where a blue flash had showed a little while since. A red light glowed suddenly where one of the white sparks crawled. One of the 2 officers behind the general spoke crisply. Instantly, it seemed, the other 3 white sparks changed their direction of movement. They swung toward the red flash, the point where a wireless from the tank represented by the first white flash had reported contact with the enemy. "Enemy tank destroyed here, sir," said the voice above the steady fingers. "Wiped out 3 of our observation posts," murmured the general. "His side knows it. That's an opportunity. Have those posts reoccupied." "Orders given, sir," said a staff officer from behind. "No reports as yet." The general's eyes went back to the space 2 miles wide and 2 miles deep in which there was only a single observation post functioning, and that in charge of 2 strayed infantrymen. The battle in the fog was in a formative stage now, and the general himself had to watch the whole, because it was by small and trivial indications that the enemy's plans would be disclosed. The dead area was no triviality, however. Half a dozen tanks were crawling through it, reporting monotonously that no sign of the enemy could be found. One of the little sparks representing those tanks abruptly went out. "Tank here, sir. No longer reports." The general watched with lackluster eyes, his mind withdrawn in thought. "Send 4 helicopters," he said slowly, "to sweep that space. We'll see what the enemy does." One of the seated officers opposite him spoke swiftly. Far away, a roaring set up and was stilled. The helicopters were taking off. They would rush across the blanket of fog, their vertical propellers sending blasts of air straight downward. For most of their sweep, they could keep a good height, but above the questionable ground they would swoop down to barely above the fog blanket. There their monstrous screws would blow holes in the fog until the ground below was visible. If any tanks crawled there, in the spaces the helicopters swept clear, They would be visible at once and would be shelled by batteries miles away, batteries invisible under the artificial cloud bank. No other noises came through the walls of the monster tank. There was a faint, monotonous murmur of the electric generator. There were the quiet, crisp orders of the officers behind the general, giving the routine commands that kept the fighting a stalemate. The aircraft officer lifted his head, pressing his headphones tightly against his ears, as if to hear more clearly. "The enemy, sir, has sent 60 fighting machines to attack our helicopters. We sent 40 single-seaters as escort." "Let them fight enough," said the general absently, "to cause the enemy to think us desperate for information. Then draw them off." There was silence again. The steady fingers put pins here and there. An enemy tank destroyed here, an American tank encountered an enemy and ceased to report further. The enemy sent 4 helicopters in a wide sweep behind the American lines, escorted by 50 fighting planes. They uncovered a squadron of 4 tanks, which scattered like insects disturbed by the overturning of a stone. Instantly after their disclosure, 150 guns, 4 miles away, were pouring shells about the place where they had been seen. 2 of the tanks ceased to report. The general's attention was called to a telephone instrument with its call light glowing. "Ah," said the general absently. "They want publicity matter." The telephone was connected to the rear, and from there to the Capitol. A much-worried cabinet waited for news, and arrangements were made and had been used to broadcast suitably arranged reports from the front. The voice of the commander-in-chief in the field going to every workshop, every gathering place, and even being bellowed by loudspeakers in the city streets. The general took the phone. The President of the United States was at the other end of the wire this time. "General?" "Still in a preliminary stage, sir," said the general, without haste. "The enemy is preparing a breakthrough effort, possibly aimed at our machine shops and supplies. Of course, if he gets them, we will have to retreat. An hour ago he paralyzed our radios, not being aware, I suppose, of our tuned Earth induction wireless sets. I dare say he is puzzled that our communications have not fallen to pieces." "But what are our chances?" The voice of the President was steady, but it was strained. "His tanks outnumber ours 2-to-1, of course, sir," said the general calmly. "Unless we can divide his fleet and destroy a part of course we will be crushed in a general combat. But we are naturally trying to make sure that any such action will take place within point-blank range of our artillery, which may help a little. We will cut the fog to secure that help, risking everything if a general engagement occurs." There was silence. The President's voice, when it came, was more strained still. "Will you speak to the public, General?" 3 sentences. I have no time for more." There were little clickings on the line, while the general's eyes returned to the board that was the battlefield in miniature. He indicated a spot with his finger. "Concentrate our reserve tanks here," he said meditatively. "Our fighting aircraft here. At once." The 2 spots were at nearly opposite ends of the battlefield. The Chief of Staff, checking the general's judgment with the alert suspicion that was the latest addition to his duties, protested sharply. "But, sir, our tanks will have no protection against helicopters." "I am quite aware of it," said the general mildly. He turned to the transmitter. A thin voice had just announced at the other end of the wire, "The Commander-in-Chief of the Army in the field will make a statement." The general spoke unhurriedly. "We are in contact with the enemy, have been for some hours. We have lost 40 tanks, and the enemy, we think, 60 or more. No general engagement has taken place, but we think decisive action on the enemy's part will be attempted within 2 hours. The tanks in the field need now, as always, ammunition, spare tanks, and the special supplies for modern warfare. In particular, we require ever-increasing quantities of fog gas. I appeal to your patriotism for reinforcements of material and men." He hung up the receiver and returned to his survey of the board. "Those 3 listening posts," he said abruptly, indicating a place near where an enemy tank had been destroyed. "Have they been reoccupied?" "Yes, sir. Just reported. The tank they reported rolled over them, destroying the placement. They are digging in." "Tell me," said the general, "when they cease to report again. They will." He watched the board again, and without lifting his eyes from it, spoke again. "That listening post in the dead sector, with the 2 strayed infantrymen in it, was it reported?" "Not yet, sir." "Tell me immediately it does." The general leaned back in his chair and deliberately relaxed. He lighted a cigar and puffed at it, his hands quite steady. Other officers, scenting the smoke, glanced up enviously. But the general was the only man who might smoke. The enemy's gases, like the American ones, could go through any gas mask if in sufficient concentration. The tanks were sealed like so many submarines, and opened their interiors to the outer air only after that air had been thoroughly tested and proven safe. Only the general might use up more than a man's allowance for breathing. The general gazed about him, letting his mind rest from its intense strain against the greater strain that would come on it in a few minutes. He looked at a tall blond man who was surveying the board intently, moving away and returning again, his forehead creased in thought. The general smiled quizzically. The man was the officer appointed to II duty, interpretive intelligence, chosen from 1,000 officers because the most exhaustive psychological tests had proven that his brain worked as nearly as possible that of the enemy commander. His task was to take the place of the enemy commander, to reconstruct from the enemy movements reported and the enemy movements known as nearly as possible the enemy plans. "Well, Harlan," said the general, "where will he strike?" "He's tricky, sir," said Harlan. "That gap in our listening posts looks, of course, like preparation for a massing of his tanks inside our lines. And it would be logical that he fought off our helicopters to keep them from discovering his tanks massing in that area." The general nodded. "Quite true," he admitted. "Quite true." "But," said Harlan eagerly, "he'd know we could figure that out. And he may have wiped out listening posts to make us think he was planning just so. He may have fought off our helicopters, not to keep them from discovering his tanks in there, but to keep them from discovering that there were no tanks in there." "My own idea exactly," said the general meditatively. "But again, it looks like so much like a feint that it may be a serious blow. I dare not risk assuming it to be a feint only." He turned back to the board. "Have those 2 strayed infantrymen reported yet?" he asked sharply. "Not yet, sir." The general drummed on the table. There were 4 red flashes glowing at different points of the board. 4 points where American tanks or groups of tanks were locked in conflict with the enemy. Somewhere off in the enveloping fog that made all the world a gray chaos, lumbering, crawling monsters rammed and battered at each other at infinitely short range. They fought blindly, their guns swinging menacingly and belching lurid flames into the semi-darkness, while from all about them dropped the liquids that meant death to any man who breathed their vapor. Those gases penetrated any gas mask, and would even strike through the sag pastes that had made the vesicatory gases of 1918 futile. With tanks by thousands hidden in the fog, 4 small combats were kept up. 4 only. Battles fought with tanks as the main arm are necessarily battles of movement, more nearly akin to cavalry battles than any other, unless it be fleet actions. When the main bodies come into contact, the issue is decided quickly. There can be no long, drawn-out stalemates such as infantry trenches produced in years past. The fighting that had taken place so far, both under the fog and aloft in the air, was outpost skirmishing only. When the main body of the enemy came into action, it would be like a whirlwind, and the battle would be won or lost in a matter of minutes only. The general paid no attention to those 4 conflicts, or their possible meaning. "I want to hear from those 2 strayed infantrymen," he said quietly. "I must base my orders on what they report. The whole battle, I believe, hinges on what they have to say." He fell silent, watching the board without the tense preoccupation he had shown before. He knew the moves he had to make in any of 3 eventualities. He watched the board to make sure he would not have to make those moves before he was ready. His whole air was that of waiting. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United States, waiting to hear what he would be told by 2 strayed infantrymen lost in the fog that covered a battlefield. The fog was neither more dense nor any lighter where Corporal Wallis paused to roll his pre-war cigarette. The tobacco came from the gassed machine-gunner in the pillbox a few yards off. Sergeant Coffey, 3 yards distant, was a blurred figure. Corporal Wallis put his cigarette into his mouth, struck his match, and puffed delicately. "Ah," said Corporal Wallis, and cheered considerably. He thought he saw Sergeant Coffey moving toward him, and ungenerously hid his cigarette's glow. Overhead, a machine-gun suddenly burst into a rattling roar, the sound sweeping above them with incredible speed. Another gun answered it. Abruptly, the whole sky above them was an inferno of such tearing noises, and immediately after they began a multitudinous bellowing set up. Airplanes on patrol ordinarily kept their engines muffled, in hopes of locating a tank below them by its noise. But in actual fighting, there was too much power to be gained by cutting out the muffler for any minor motive to take effect. 100 aircraft above the heads of the 2 strayed infantrymen were fighting madly about 5 helicopters. 200 yards away, one fell to the earth with a crash, and immediately afterward there was a hollow boom. For an instant, even the mist was tinged with yellow from the exploded gasoline tank. But the roaring above continued, not mounting as in a battle between opposing patrols of fighting planes, when each side finds height a decisive advantage, but keeping nearly to the same level, little above the bank of cloud. Something came down, roaring, and struck the earth no more than 50 yards away. The impact was terrific, but after it there was a dead silence while the thunder above kept on. Sergeant Coffey came leaping to Corporal Wallis' side. "Helicopters," he barked. "Hunting tanks and pillboxes. Lay down." He flung himself down to the earth. Wind beat on them suddenly, then an outrageous blast of icy air from above. For an instant the sky lightened. They saw a hole in the mist, saw the little pillbox clearly, saw a huge framework of supporting screws sweeping swiftly overhead with figures in it watching the ground through wide-angle glasses, and machine-gunners firing madly at dancing things in the air. Then it was gone. "One of ours!" shouted Coffey in Wallace's ear. "They're trying to find the Yellow's tanks!" The center of the roaring seemed to shift, perhaps to the north. Then a roaring drowned out all the other roarings. This one was lower down and approaching in a rush. Something swooped from the south, a dark blotch in the lighter mist above. It was an airplane flying in the mist, a plane that had dived into the fog as into oblivion. It appeared, was gone, and there was a terrific crash. A shattering roar drowned out even the droning tumult of 100 aircraft engines. A sheet of flame flashed up, and a thunderous detonation. "Hit a tree," panted Coffey, scrambling to his feet again. "Suicide Club, aiming for our helicopter." Corporal Wallis was pointing, his lips drawn back in a snarl. "Shut up," he whispered. "I saw a shadow against that flash. Yeller infantryman. Let's get him." "You're crazy," said Sergeant Coffee, but he strained his eyes, more especially his ears. It was Coffee who clutched Corporal Wallace's wrist and pointed. Wallace could see nothing, but he followed as Coffee moved silently through the gray mist. Presently he, too, straining his eyes, saw an indistinct movement. The roaring of motors died away suddenly. The fighting had stopped, a long way off, apparently because the helicopters had been withdrawn. Except for the booming of artillery a very long distance away, firing unseen at an unseen target, there was no noise at all. "Aimin' for our pillbox," whispered Coffee. They saw the dim shape, moving noiselessly, halt. The dim figure seemed to be casting about for something. It went down on hands and knees and crawled forward. The two infantrymen crept after it. It stopped and turned around. The two dodged to one side in haste. The enemy infantrymen crawled off in another direction, the two Americans following him as closely as they dared. He halted once more, a dim and grotesque figure in the fog. They saw him fumbling in his belt. He threw something, suddenly. There was a little tap, as of a fountain pen dropped upon concrete. Then a hissing sound. That was all, but the enemy infantrymen waited, as if listening. The two Americans fell upon him as one individual. They bore him to the earth, and Coffee dragged at his gas mask, good tactics in a battle where every man carries gas grenades. He gasped and fought desperately, in a seeming frenzy of terror. They squatted over him, finally having taken away his automatics, and Coffee worked painstakingly to get off his gas mask while Wallace went poking about in quest of tobacco. "Doggone," said Coffee. "This mask is intricate." "He ain't got any pockets," mourned Wallace. Then they examined him more closely. "It's a whole suit," explained Coffee. He don't have to bother with sag paste. He's got him on a land diving suit." "Say," gasped the prisoner, his language utterly colloquial in spite of the beady eyes and coarse black hair that marked him racially as of the enemy. "Say, don't take off my mask. Don't take off my mask." "He talks and everything," observed Coffee in mild amazement. He inspected the mask again and painstakingly smashed the goggles. "Now, big boy, you take your chance with the rest of us. What you doin' round here?" The prisoner set his teeth, though deathly pale, and did not reply. Said Coffee meditatively. "Let's take him in the pillbox and let Lieutenant Madison tell us what to do with him." They picked him up. "No, no! For God's sake, no!" cried the prisoner shrilly. "I just gassed it." The two halted. Coffee scratched his nose. "Reckon he's lyin', Pete?" he asked. Corporal Wallace shrugged gloomily. "He ain't got no tobacco," he said morosely. "Let's chuck him in first and see." The prisoner wriggled until Coffee put his own automatic in the small of his back. "How long does that gas last?" he asked, frowning. "Lieutenant Madison wants us to report. There's some fellers in there, all gassed up. But we were in there a while back, and it didn't hurt us. How long does it last?" "For 15 minutes, maybe 20, chattered the prisoner. "Don't put me in there." Coffee scratched his nose again and looked at his wristwatch. "All right," he conceded. "We give you 20 minutes. Then we chuck you down inside. That is, if you act real agreeable until then. Got anything to smoke?" The prisoner agonizedly opened a zipper slip in his costume and brought out tobacco, even tailor-made cigarettes. Coffee pounced on them 1 second before Wallace. Then he divided them with absorbed and scrupulous fairness. "Right," said Sergeant Coffee comfortably. He lighted up. "Say, if you want to smoke, here's one of your pills. Let's see that gas stuff. How you use it?" Wallace had stripped off a heavy belt about the prisoner's waist, and it was trailing over his arm. He inspected it now. There were 20 or 30 little sticks in it, each one barely larger than a lead pencil, of dirty gray color, and each one securely nested in a tube of flannel-lined papier-mâché. "These things?" asked Wallace contentedly. He was inhaling deeply with that luxurious enjoyment a tailor-made cigarette can give a man who had been remaking butts into smokes for days past. "Don't touch 'em," warned the prisoner nervously. "You broke my goggles. You throw 'em, and they light and catch fire, and that scatters the gas." Coffee touched the prisoner, indicating the ground, and sat down, comfortably smoking one of the prisoner's cigarettes. By his air, he began to approve of his captive. "Say, you," he said curiously, "you talk English pretty good. How'd you learn it?" "I was a waiter," the prisoner explained. "New York, corner 58th and 6th. "My God," said Coffee. "Me, I used to be a movie operator along there, 49th. Projection room stuff, you know. Say, you know Heine's place?" "Sure," said the prisoner. "I used to buy scotch from that blond feller in the back room, with a benzene label for a prescription." Coffee lay back and slapped his knee. "Ain't it a small world?" he demanded. "Pete here, he ain't never been in any town bigger than Chicago. Ever in Chicago?" "Hell," said Wallace, morose yet comfortable with a tailor-made cigarette. "If you guys want to start a extra war, go to knockin' Chicago, that's all." Coffee looked at his wristwatch again. "Got 10 minutes yet," he observed. "Say, you must know Pete Hanfrey." "Sure, I know him," said the enemy prisoner scornfully. "I waited on him, one day, just before us reserves were called back home." In the monster tank that was headquarters, the general tapped his fingers on his knees. The pale white light flickered a little as it shone on the board where the bright sparks crawled. White sparks were American tanks. Blue flashes were for enemy tanks sighted and reported, usually in the 3-second interval between their identification and the annihilation of the observation post that had reported them. Red glows showed encounters between American and enemy tanks. There were a dozen red glows visible, with from 1 to a dozen white sparks hovering about them. It seemed as if the whole front line were about to burst into a glare of red, were about to become one long lane of conflicts in impenetrable obscurity, where metal monsters roared and rumbled and clanked one against the other, bellowing and belching flame and ramming each other savagely, while from them dripped the liquids that made their breath mean death. There were nightmarish conflicts in progress under the blanket of fog, unparalleled save perhaps in the undersea battles between submarines in the previous European war. The chief of staff looked up, his face drawn. "General," he said harshly, "it looks like a frontal attack all along our line." The general's cigar had gone out. He was pale, but calm with an iron composure. "Yes," he conceded. "But you forget that blank spot in our line. We do not know what is happening there." "I am not forgetting it, but the enemy outnumbers us 2 to 1. "I am waiting," said the general, "to hear from those 2 infantrymen who reported some time ago from a listen post in the dead area." The chief of staff pointed to the outline formed by the red glows where tanks were battling. "Those fights are keeping up too long," he said sharply. "General, don't you see, they're driving back our line, but they aren't driving it back as fast as if they were throwing their whole weight on it. If they were making a frontal attack there, they'd wipe out the tanks we have facing them. They'd roll right over them. That's a feint. They're concentrating in the dead space." "I am waiting," said the general softly, "to hear from those 2 infantrymen." He looked at the board again and said quietly, Have the call signal sent them. They may answer." He struck a match to relight his dead cigar. His fingers barely quivered as they held the match. It might have been excitement, but it might have been foreboding, too. "By the way," he said, holding the match clear, "have our machine shops and supply tanks ready to move. Every plane is, of course, ready to take the air on signal. But get the aircraft ground personnel in their traveling tanks immediately." Voices began to murmur orders as the general puffed. He watched the board steadily. "Let me know if anything is heard from these infantrymen." There was a definite air of strain within the tank that was headquarters. It was a sort of tensity that seemed to emanate from the general himself. Where Coffee and Wallace and the prisoner squatted on the ground, however, there was no sign of strain at all. There was a steady gabble of voices. "What kind of rations they give you?" asked Coffee interestedly. The enemy prisoner listed them, with profane side comments. "Hell," said Wallace gloomily, "you ought to see what we get. Last week they fed us worse'n dogs. And the canteen stuff—" "Your tank men, they get treated fancy?" asked the prisoner. Coffee made a reply consisting almost exclusively of high-powered expletives. "And the infantry gets it in the neck every time," he finished savagely. "We do all the work." Guns began to boom far away. Wallace cocked his ears. "Tanks getting together," he judged gloomily. "If they'd all blow each other to hell and let us infantry fight this battle." "Damn the tanks," said the enemy prisoner viciously. "Look here, you fellers, look at me. They sent a battalion of us out in 2 waves. We hike along by compass through the fog, supposed to be 5 paces apart. We come on a pillbox or listening post, we gas it and go on. We try not to make a noise. We try not to get seen before we use our gas. We go on deep in your line as we can. We hear one of your tanks, we dodge it if we can, so we don't get seen at all. Of course, we give it a dose of gas in passing just in case. But we don't get any orders about how far to go or how to come back. We ask for recognition signals for our own tanks, and they grin and say we won't see none of our tanks till the battle's over. They say reform and march back when the fog is out. Ain't that pretty for you?" "You second wave?" asked Coffee with interest. The prisoner nodded. "Mopping up," he said bitterly, "what the first wave left. No fun in that. We go along gassing dead men, and all the time your tanks is raving around to find out what's happening to their listening posts. They run into us." Coffee nodded sympathetically. "The infantry always gets the dirty end of the stick," said Wallace morosely. Somewhere something blew up with a violent explosion. The noise of battle in the distance became heavier and heavier. "Going it strong," said the prisoner, listening. "Yeah," said Coffee. He looked at his wristwatch. "Say, that 20 minutes is up. You go down in there first, big boy." They stood beside the little pillbox. The prisoner's knee shook. "Say, fellers," he said pleadingly, "they told us that stuff would scatter in 20 minutes, but you busted my mask. Yours ain't any good against this gas. I'll have to go down in there if you fellers make me, but—" Coffee lighted another of the prisoner's tailor-made cigarettes. "Give you 5 minutes more," he said graciously. "I don't suppose it'll ruin the war." They sat down relievedly again, while the fog gas made all the earth invisible behind a pall of grayness, a grayness from which the noises of battle came. In the tank that was headquarters, the air of strain was pronounced. The maneuver board showed the situation as close to desperation now. The reserve tank positions had been switched on the board, dim orange glows, massed in curiously precise blocks. And little squares of green showed there that the supply and machine shop tanks were massed. They were moving slowly across the maneuver board. but the principal change lay in the front-line indications. The red glows that showed where tank battles were in progress formed an irregularly curved line now. There were 20 or more such isolated battles in progress, varying from single combats between single tanks to greater conflicts where 20 to 30 tanks to a side were engaged. And the positions of those conflicts were changing constantly, and invariably the American tanks were being pushed back. The two staff officers behind the general were nearly silent. There were few sparks crawling within the American lines now. Nearly every one had been diverted into front-line battles. The two men watched the board with feverish intensity, watching the red glows moving back and back. The chief of staff was shaking like a leaf, watching the American line stretched and stretched. The general looked at him with a twisted smile. "I know my opponent," he said suddenly. "I had lunch with him once in Vienna. We were attending a disarmament conference." He seemed to be amused at the ironic statement. "We talked war and battles, of course, and he showed me, drawing on the tablecloth, the tactical scheme that should have been used at Cambrai back in 1917. It was a singularly perfect plan. It was a beautiful one." "General," burst out one of the two staff officers behind him, "I need 20 tanks from the reserves." "Take them," said the general. He went on, addressing his chief of staff. "It was an utterly flawless plan. I talked to other men. We were all pretty busy estimating each other there, we soldiers. We discussed each other with some freedom, I may say. And I formed the opinion that the man who is in command of the enemy is an artist, a soldier with the spirit of an amateur. He's a very skillful fencer, by the way. Doesn't that suggest anything?" The chief of staff had his eyes glued to the board. "That is a feint, sir. A strong feint, yes, but he has his force concentrated in the dead area." "You are not listening, sir," said the general, reprovingly. "I am saying that my opponent is an artist, an amateur, the sort of person who delights in the delicate work of fencing. I, sir, would thank God for the chance to defeat my enemy. He has twice my force, but he will not be content merely to defeat me. He will want to defeat me by a plan of consummate artistry, which will arouse admiration among soldiers for years to come." "But, General, every minute, every second—" "We are losing men, of whom we have plenty, and tanks, of which we have not enough. True, very true," conceded the general. "But I am waiting to hear from 2 strayed infantrymen. When they report, I will speak to them myself." "But, sir," cried the chief of staff, withheld only by the iron habit of discipline from violent action and the taking over of command himself, "they may be dead. You can't risk this battle waiting for them. You can't risk it, sir. You can't." "They are not dead," said the general coolly. "They cannot be dead. Sometimes, sir, we must obey the motto on our coins. Our country needs this battle to be won. We have got to win it, sir. And the only way to win it—" The signal light on his telephone glowed. The general snatched it up, his hands quivering. But his voice was steady and deliberate as he spoke. "Hello, Sergeant. Sergeant Coffee, is it? Very well, Sergeant. Tell me what you found out. Your prisoner objects to his rations, eh? Very well, go on." "How did he gas our listening posts?" "He did, eh? He got turned around and you caught him wandering about? Oh, he was second wave? They weren't taking any chances on any of our listening posts reporting their tanks, eh? Say that again, Sergeant Coffee." The general's tone had changed indescribably. "Your prisoner has no recognition signals for his own tanks? They told him he wouldn't see any of them until the battle was over?" "Thank you, Sergeant. One of our tanks will stop for you. This is the commanding general speaking." He rang off, his eyes blazing. Relaxation was gone. He was a dynamo, snapping orders. Supply tanks, machine shop tanks, ground forces of the air service, concentrate here." His finger rested on a spot in the middle of the dead area. "Reserve tanks take position behind them. Draw off every tank we've got, take 'em out of action, and mass them in front, on a line with our former first line of outposts. Every airplane and helicopter take the air and engage in general combat with the enemy, wherever the enemy may be found and in whatever force. And our tanks move straight through here." Orders were snapping into telephone transmitters. The commands had been relayed before their import was fully realized. Then there was a gasp. "General," cried the Chief of Staff, "if the enemy is massed there, he'll destroy our forces in detail as they take position." "He isn't massed there," said the general, his eyes blazing. "The infantrymen who were gassing our listening posts were given no recognition signals for their tanks. Sergeant Coffey's prisoner has his gas mask broken and is in deadly fear. The enemy commander is foolish in many ways, perhaps, but not foolish enough to break down morale by refusing recognition signals to his own men who will need them. And look at the beautiful plan he's got." He sketched half a dozen lines with his fingers, moving them in lightning gestures as his orders took effect. "His main force is here, behind those skirmishes that look like a feint. As fast as we reinforce our skirmishing line, he reinforces his. Just enough to drive our tanks back slowly. It looks like a strong feint, but it's a trap. This dead space is empty. He thinks we are concentrating to face it. When he is sure of it, his helicopters will sweep across any minute now to see, he'll throw his whole force on our front line. It'll crumple up. His whole fighting force will smash through to take us, facing the dead space in the rear. With twice our numbers, he'll drive us before him." "But, General, you're ordering a concentration there. You're falling in with his plans." The general laughed. "I had lunch with the general in command over there once upon a time. He is an artist. He won't be content with a defeat like that. He'll want to make his battle a masterpiece, a work of art. There's just one touch he can add. He has to have reserves to protect his supply tanks and machine shops. They're fixed. The ideal touch, the perfect tactical fillip will be here. Look. He expects to smash in our rear here. The heaviest blow will fall here. He will swing around our right wing, drive us out of the dead area into his own lines, and drive us on his reserves. Do you see it? He'll use every tank he's got in one beautiful final blow. We'll be outwitted, outnumbered, outflanked, and finally caught between his main body and his reserves and pounded to bits. It is a perfect, a masterly bit of work." He watched the board hawk-like. "We'll concentrate, but our machine shops and supplies will concentrate with us. Before he has time to take us in rear, we'll drive ahead, in just the line he plans for us. We don't wait to be driven into his reserves. We roll into them and over them. We smash his supplies. We destroy his shops. And then we can advance along his line of communication and destroy it, our own depots being blown up, give the orders when necessary, and leaving him stranded with motor-driven tanks, motorized artillery, and nothing to run his motors with. He'll be marooned beyond help in the middle of our country, and we will have him at our mercy when his tanks run out of fuel. As a matter of fact, I shall expect him to surrender in 3 days." The little blocks of green and yellow that had showed the position of the reserve and supply tanks changed abruptly to white, and began to crawl across the maneuver board. Other little white sparks turned about. Every white spark upon the maneuver board suddenly took to itself a new direction. "Disconnect cables," said the general crisply. "We move with our tanks in the lead." The monotonous humming of the electric generator was drowned out in a thunderous uproar that was muffled as an airtight door was shut abruptly. 15 seconds later there was a violent lurch, and the colossal tank was on the move in the midst of a crawling, thundering horde of metal monsters, whose lumbering progress shook the earth. Sergeant Coffee, still blinking his amazement, absent-mindedly lighted the last of his share of the cigarettes looted from the prisoner. "The big guy himself," he said, still stunned. "My God, the big guy himself!" A distant thunder began, a deep-toned rumbling that seemed to come from the rear. It came nearer and grew louder. A peculiar quivering seemed to set up in the earth. The noise was tanks moving through the fog. Not one tank, or 2 tanks, or 20 tanks, but all the tanks in creation rumbling and lurching at their topmost speed in serried array. Corporal Wallis heard and turned pale. The prisoner heard, and his knees caved in. "Hell," said Corporal Wallis despairingly. "They can't see us, and they couldn't dodge us if they did." The prisoner wailed and slumped to the floor. Coffee picked him up by the collar and jerked him out of the pillbox. "Come on, Pete," he ordered briefly. "They ain't givin' us a infantryman's chance, but maybe we can do some dodgin'." Then the roar of engines, of metal treads crushing upon earth and clinking upon their joints, drowned out all possible other sounds. Before the 3 men beside the pillbox could have moved a muscle, monster shapes loomed up, rushing, rolling, lurching, squeaking. They thundered past, and the hot fumes of their exhaust enveloped the trio. Coffee growled and put himself in a position of defiance. His feet braced against the concrete of the pillbox dome. His expression was snarling and angry, but surreptitiously he crossed himself. He heard the fellows of the 2 tanks that had roared by him, thundering along in alignment to the right and left. A 20-yard space, a second row of the monsters came hurtling on, gun muzzles gaping, gas tubes elevated, spitting smoke from their exhausts that was even thicker than the fog. A third row, a fourth, a fifth. The universe was a monster uproar. One could not think in this volume of sound. It seemed that there was fighting overhead. Crackling noises came feebly through the reverberating uproar that was the Army of the United States in full charge. Something came whirling down through the overhanging mist and exploded in a lurid flare that, for a second or two, cast the grotesque shadows of a row of tanks clearly before the trio of shaken infantrymen. Still the tanks came on and roared past. 20 tanks, 21, 22. Coffee lost count, dazed and almost stunned by the sheer noise. It rose from the earth and seemed to be echoed back from the topmost limit of the skies. It was a colossal din, an incredible uproar, a sustained thunder that beat at the eardrums like the reiterated concussions of 1,000 guns that fired without ceasing. There was no intermission, no cessation of the tumult. Row after row after row of the monsters roared by, beaked and armed, going greedily with hungry guns into battle. And then, for a space of seconds, no tanks passed. Through the pandemonium of their going, however, the sound of firing somehow seemed to creep. It was gunfire of incredible intensity, and it came from the direction in which the front-rank tanks were heading. 48, 49, 40-10, 40-11, muttered Coffee dazedly, his senses beaten down almost to unconsciousness by the ordeal of sound. God, the whole army went by! The roaring of the fighting tanks was less, but it was still a monstrous din. Through it, however, came now a series of concussions that were so close together that they were inseparable, and so violent that they were like slaps upon the chest. Then came other noises, louder only because nearer. These were different noises, too, from those the fighting tanks had made. Lighter noises. The curious, misshapen service tanks began to rush by, of all sizes and all shapes. Fuel carrier tanks, machine shop tanks, huge ones these, commissary tanks. Something enormous and glistening stopped short. A door opened. A voice roared an order. The 3 men, beaten and whipped by noise, stared dumbly. "Sergeant Coffee!" roared the voice. "Bring your men, quick!" Coffee dragged himself back to a semblance of life. Corporal Wallis moved forward, sagging. The two of them loaded their prisoner into the door and tumbled in. They were instantly sent into a heap as the tank took up its progress again with a sudden sharp leap. "Good man," grinned a sooty-faced officer, clinging to a handhold. "The general sent special orders you were to be picked up. Said you'd won the battle. It isn't finished yet, but when the general says that—" "Battle?" said Coffee dully. "This ain't my battle. It's a parade of a lot of damn tanks." There was a howl of joy from somewhere above. Discipline in the machine shop tanks was strict enough, but vastly different in kind from the formality of the fighting machines. "Contact!" roared the voice again. "General Wireless is going again. Our fellows have rolled over their reserves and are smashing their machine shops and supplies." Yells reverberated deafeningly inside the steel walls, already filled with tumult from the running motors and rumbling treads. "Smashed 'em up!" shrieked the voice above, insane with joy. "Smashed 'em! Smashed 'em! Smashed 'em! We've wiped out their whole reserve, and—" A series of detonations came through even the steel shell of the lurching tank. Detonation so violent, so monstrous, that even through the springs and treads of the tank the earth concussion could be felt. "There goes their ammunition! We set off all their dumps!" There was sheer pandemonium inside the service tank, speeding behind the fighting force with only a thin skin of reserve tanks between it and a panic-stricken, mechanically pursuing enemy. "Yell, you birds!" screamed the voice. "The general says we've won the battle. Thanks to the fighting force. We're to go on and wipe out the enemy line of communications, letting him chase us till his gas gives out. Then we come back and pound him to bits. Our tanks have wiped him out." Coffee managed to find something to hold on to. He struggled to his feet. Corporal Wallis, recovering from the certainty of death and the torture of sound, was being very seasick from the tank's motion. The prisoner moved away from him on the steel floor. He looked gloomily up at Coffee. "Listen to 'em," said Coffee bitterly. "Tanks, tanks, tanks. Hell, if they'd given us infantry a chance—" "You said it," said the prisoner savagely. "This is a hell of a way to fight a war." Corporal Wallis turned a greenish face to them. "The infantry always gets the dirty end of the stick," he gasped. Now they makin' infantry ride in tanks. Hell." The end of Tanks by Murray Leinster.
Part 13 of Astounding Stories, January 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Winterrowd. Astounding Stories, January 1930. Invisible Death by Anthony Pelcher. The inquest into the mysterious death of Darius Darrow, savant, inventor, recluse, and eccentric, resembled a scientific convention. Men and women of high scientific attainment, and in some instances world fame, attended to hear firsthand the strange, uncanny, unbelievable circumstances as hinted by the newspapers. Mrs. Susan Darrow, the widow, was the paramount witness. She appeared a quaint figure as she took the stand. Tearful yet alert, this little woman betrayed the intelligence that had made her one of the world's foremost chemists. She gave her age as 58, but if it had not been for her snowy hair, she would have looked much younger. She was small but not frail, and had expressive blue eyes. She had a firm little nose and chin, and was garbed in black silk garments of a fashion evidently dating back a decade. Although not modern in dress, her answers to questions regarding scientific and business affairs involved in the mysterious case proved she was thoroughly abreast of the times in all other particulars. "You believe your husband was murdered?" bluntly asked the examiner at one stage. "That is my opinion," she said, then added, "it might have been some scientific accident, the nature of which I cannot fathom. We were confidential in all matters except my husband's work. He reserved the right to be secretive about the scientific problems on which he was working." "Can you throw any light on a motive for such a crime?" "The motive seems self-evident. He was working on an invention that he said would do away with war, and would make the owner of the device a practical world dictator should he choose to exercise such power. The device was completed. The murderer killed him to secure this device. That all seems plain enough." "Was anything else of value taken?" "We had nothing else of value about the place. I was never given to jewelry. The furnishings and equipment were undisturbed. It is quite evident, I think, that the thief was no ordinary petty burglar." The attorney interposed. "I believe we had better let Mrs. Darrow tell this story from the beginning in her own way. There are only two really important witnesses. Whatever she can remember to recite might be of value to the authorities. Now, Mrs. Darrow, how long had you lived at Brooknook? Begin there and just let your story unfold. Try to control your nerves and emotions." "I am not emotional. I am not nervous," said the quaint little woman bravely. "My heart hurts, that is all. The place was named by my father. We inherited it at his death 30 years ago and moved in. My 2 children were born and died there. At first we kept the servants and maintained all of the 32 rooms, but after the children were gone, we both gave ourselves over to study, and we began to close one room after another, releasing the servants one by one." "How many rooms do you occupy now?" "We lived in 3, a living room, kitchen, and bedroom. The 2 big parlors were turned into a laboratory. We both worked there. It was there my husband met his death at his work. Sometimes we worked together, sometimes independently. I did all my own housework except the laundry, which I sent out. We had no visitors. We lived for each other and our work." "Tell us about the rooms that were not occupied." "We left them just as they had always been. I have not been in any of these rooms for 20 years. Once I looked into the little girl's room, my daughter's room. It was dusty and cobwebby, but undisturbed by human hand. My husband peered in over my shoulder. I closed the door. We turned away in each other's arms." Here the little old woman fell to weeping softly into her lace handkerchief. Minutes lapsed as the court waited, respecting her grief. "Were these rooms locked?" asked the attorney finally. "No," said the widow, recovering as she dabbed at her eyes. "We feared no one. All the rooms were closed, but not locked. The outside doors were seldom locked. We lived in our own world. For appearance sake we kept up the grounds. Peck, the gardener, kept the grounds, as you know. He called in outside help when necessary. That was his affair. We never bothered him. He lived probably a half a mile up the road. The first of each month he would come for his pay. He was practically our only visitor. When it was necessary to see our attorney or other connections, Peck would drive us. At first he used to drive our horses. 10 years ago we pastured the horses for life and bought the small car. We seldom went out. We have no close friends and no relatives nearer than the Pacific coast. They are distant cousins. You see, we were rather alone in the world since the children went away. We never spoke of them as being dead." Again the court was hushed. The coroner and the attorney took occasion to blow their noses rather violently. "On May 27th, the day your husband died, what happened as you remember it?" asked the attorney. "We arose and had breakfast as usual. I was puttering about the rooms. My husband kissed me and started for the laboratory. I was in the kitchen. It was about 10 o'clock when I finished in the kitchen and went into the living room which adjoins the laboratory. I had been rather fretted, something unusual for me. It seemed I dimly sensed the presence of someone near me, someone I did not know, an outsider. I thought it was foolish of me and buckled up. But when I went into the living room, it seemed as if some invisible presence were following me. I could hear the low hum of my husband's device. The door of the laboratory was open. He called to me and said, 'Sue, dear, it seems strange, but I made 2 models of this set and now I can find only one. You could not have misplaced the other by any chance, could you?" I assured him that I knew nothing of it, and he said, "That's funny." Then he went back into the library and closed the door. The humming continued. I was more annoyed than ever, but I did not want to bother my husband. Then a queer thing happened. I saw the door of the laboratory open and close, but I did not see anyone. The next instant I heard my husband's outcry. It was more a groan than a scream. I rushed into the laboratory. My husband was lying by his slate-top table. The device, I noticed, was gone. It was no bigger than a coffee mill, I thought, as I bent over my husband. Strange how such a thought could have crowded in at such a time. My husband's head was bleeding. It was a cut, a long gash over the ear, just below the bald spot. It must have been a frightful blow. I looked in his eyes. My nurses and pharmaceutical course gave me knowledge which sent a chill to my heart. He was dead. I must have fainted. When I recovered, I ran for Peck. I found him near the house, coming my way and holding his right eye. "Something struck me," he said. Then, seeing me so pale, he said, "My God, Mrs. Darrow, what has happened?" "Run for the doctor," I said. When the doctor came, he called the police and coroner. They told me not to disturb the body. Later they took it away, and the gardener told me— "Never mind what Peck told you," interrupted the attorney. "We will let him tell it. Is that all you can tell us about the death itself?" But the widow was weeping now, so violently that the court ordered her excused. The gardener was called, and took the stand, displaying a big black eye, which offered comedy relief to a pathetic situation. "On the main road to the east," he began after preliminary questioning, "was a small car, which had been parked there all morning. I noticed it because it had no license plates. It was visible from the inside of the grounds, but was hidden from the road by a hedge. It made me wonder because it was just inside our grounds. I had some very special red flags which I planted as a border back of pink geraniums. They were doing fine. I got them from the Fabrish seed house. There are no plants like Fabrish's. I wouldn't give a snap of my finger for all the other—" "Just a minute," interrupted the attorney. He told the gardener to never mind the geraniums and flags, but to tell just what happened. "Well, I was bending over the border bed when I heard sounds like someone running along the gravel path toward me. I heard a humming like a bumblebee, and I jumped to my feet. Just then something hit me in the eye and knocked me down. Yes, sir, knocked me plumb down, and—" "Then what happened? Never mind the asides, the extras. Tell us just the simple facts," instructed the attorney. "Well, you won't believe it, but I heard the footsteps leave the road. The geraniums were badly trampled. I looked at the parked automobile and could hear the hum coming from there. The machine started and turned into the road." "Did you notice anyone at the wheel?" "That's what you're not going to believe. There wasn't anybody in that auto at all. I didn't see anyone at any time. The auto started itself, and what is more, that auto only went about 100 yards when it disappeared altogether. Like that. Like a flash." "Did it turn off the road?" "It didn't turn anywhere. It was in the middle of the road. It just disappeared right in the middle of the road. It started without a driver, it turned north without a driver, and went on by itself for about 100 yards. Then it vanished in the middle of the road, just dropped out of sight." The courtroom was hushed. The audience and court attaches were awe-stricken and looked their incredulity. "Do you mean to tell us that the auto drove itself?" asked the court sternly. The witness was completely confused. The attorney came to his rescue, looked at the court, and said, "He has told that same story 100 times, and he will stick to it. It seems impossible, but has not Mrs. Darrow told us she heard this humming and saw nothing?" With the purely perfunctory recitals of the doctor and the constabulary, this court and the jury have heard all there is to hear. We have no more witnesses. That is all there is. The jury will have to decide from the evidence whether this case is accident or murder. The doctor and 2 experts have reported that the wound appeared to have been made by some blunt instrument, swung powerfully. The skull under the wound and back of the ear was simply crushed. Death was instantaneous. It all happened in broad daylight. After an hour's deliberation, the jury decided the savant came to his death in his laboratory from a blow on the skull received in some manner unknown. The crowd filed out, spiritedly discussing the unusual crime. In the crowd was Perkins Ferguson, known as Old Perk, head of the Shefford Engineering Corporation, who paid royalty on some of the Darrow patents. With him was Damon Farnsworth, his first vice president. "Well, what do you think of it?" asked Farnsworth, biting into a black cigar. "Damned weird, isn't it?" replied Old Perk. "I have my own theory, however," he added, "but I am going to know a whole lot more about this case before I venture it." The pair climbed into Ferguson's car, discussing the Darrow death case with furrowed brows. What might be termed an extraordinary meeting of the directors of the Shefford Engineering Corporation was held a few days later in a big building in the financial district. The rich furnishings of the directors' room indicated, better than Bradstreet's, the great wealth of the corporation. Uniformed pages stood at attention at each end of the long mahogany table at which were seated the 14 directors of the company. All were men of wealth, standing, and engineering knowledge. The departed Darrow often had been summoned to such meetings, and at this one there was a hush because of his recent demise. After a batch of preliminary business had been transacted, Ferguson arose and cleared his throat. The directors leaned forward in their chairs expectantly. The page boys lost their mechanical attitude for the instant and fairly craned their necks around the bulks of the forms in front of them. "The Darrow case has taken a sudden and sinister turn," said the president. "I have a letter. I will read it." "Old Perk, get wise to yourself. We are in a position to destroy you and all the potbellies in the Wall Street crowd. If you want to die of old age, remember what happened to Darrow, and begin declaring us in on Wall Street dividends. If you do not, you will follow Darrow in the same way. Our first demand is for $100,000. Leave this amount in hundreds and fifties in the rubbish can at the corner of 50th Street and Broadway at 10 a.m. next Thursday. If you fail, we will break your damn neck. Bring the police with you if you like. Invisible Death. Ferguson passed the letter around for inspection. It was painstakingly printed, evidently from the type in a rubber stamp set such as is sold in toy stores. "I have decided," said Perkins at length, "to give this case to Walter Lees. He has never failed us in mechanical, chemical, or any form of scientific problem. I hope he will not fail us in this. He will work independently of the police, who have requested that we keep the appointment at 50th Street and Broadway at the hour named. We will deposit a roll of newspapers, around which has been wrapped a $50 bill, and then we will stand by while the awaiting detectives do their duty." "You do not think anyone is going to call for any supposed package of money at one of the most congested corners in the world at broad daylight?" asked the director at the end of the table. "Why not?" asked Ferguson. "A seedy individual could pick a package from a rubbish bin at that corner without attracting the least attention." "I guess you're right," agreed the doubting one. "I know I'm right," said the president, and he usually was. "I have already arranged to have Lees instructed in his work," Ferguson volunteered as a pause came in the buzz of conversation around the table. "Lees is young, but he is capable." There was general discussion of the strange case of Darius Darrow, the room filled with the blue haze of many cigars. Suddenly a low humming sound was heard in the room. Papers on the director's table were bunched as if by unseen hands and thrown to the ceiling, from which they descended like flakes of snow and scattered about the room. A book of minutes was torn from the hands of a secretary. It was raised and brought down on Vice President Farnsworth's head. A chair was pulled out from under another direction, and he was deposited in an undignified heap on the floor. Another director acted as though he had been tripped, and he fell on top of Farnsworth. The two big vases crashed to the floor in bits. Other decorative objects were scattered about. The directors who had been hurtled to the floor stood up with expressions of comical surprise on their features. Their chairs catapulted into a far corner of the room, one after the other. Startled expressions resounded from the group. A small bookcase fell on its front with a crash of glass. Ferguson's cane jumped in the air and crashed a window pane. The humming ceased suddenly. The room was a wreck. The assembled men stood aghast. They were simply nonplussed. Finally, they phoned for the police. After hearing the strange recital from so many highly reputable witnesses, a detective sergeant who had responded to the call with others reported to headquarters. A uniformed police guard was sent to the place with instructions to remain on duty until relieved. Ferguson sent for Walter Lees, the young engineer of whom he had spoken to the directorate. Assigned to the task of unraveling the Darrow death mystery, Lees ran true to form by getting busy at once. This was at midnight of the day of the surprising directors' meeting. Lees owned a big car. He piled into it and headed for the scene of the crime. Daybreak found him examining every inch of the road around the Darrow estate. Then he searched the hedge along the east road, where the phantom auto had disappeared after the crime. The brush along the opposite side of the thoroughfare was also gone over. Passing autos had stopped to ask the meaning of his flashlight. Lees explained that he had lost a pocketbook. It was as good an excuse as any, and served to keep him from drawing a crowd. He found nothing to reward his long and painstaking efforts. At 7 a.m. he decided to interview the Darrow widow, and found her already up and about her kitchen, weeping softly as she worked. She bade him be seated in the living room. "No, I am not afraid to stay here alone," she said in reply to Lee's first question. "Whoever killed my husband did so to get possession of his second model. They had already stolen the first. I have thought since that they were afraid that the finding of the second model after his death would aid in their detection. For some reason they had to have both models." She agreed to tell all she knew of the case. Lees listened to the long recital as already recorded at the coroner's inquest. By adroit questioning, Lees gained just one new fact. Mrs. Darrow remembered that she had called her husband, just before he retired to his laboratory, to fix a towel hanger in the kitchen. "He found the pivot needed oiling," explained the widow. "That was all. He oiled it and went into the laboratory." The idea of one of the world's greatest mechanical engineers stopping his work to oil a towel hanger caused Lees to smile. But Mrs. Darrow did not smile. "My husband was a genius at repairing about the house," she said in all seriousness. "I can imagine so," agreed Lees. The conversation ceased. Lees sat for a few minutes with his head in his hands, thinking deeply. Finally he said: "I am convinced that someone who was well aware of your husband's habits committed this crime. Do you believe positively that the gardener is above suspicion?" "Oh, it couldn't have been Peck," insisted Mrs. Darrow. "I had seen him down near the gate from the window. He was too far from the house, and besides, he was devoted to us both." "Then it was somebody from the neighborhood," said Lees. "Maybe so," replied Mrs. Darrow noncommittally. "Who lives in the next house south?" "That is toward the city," mused the widow. "There are no houses south on either side of the road for a little farther than a mile, when you reach the town limits of Farsdale. The town line is about halfway between, and marks the southern end of this estate." "Who lives in the first house to the north?" "That is the cottage of Peck the gardener." "How near is the next house?" "That was the parcel my father sold. It is about 3 acres, and in the center, or about the center, is the house built by Adolphe Jouret, who bought the land. He lives there with his daughter. They built a magnificent place. The brook that traverses our grounds rises at a spring back of his house. Save for 2 West Indian servants, they are alone. The servants live in Farsdale and motor back and forth." "What do you know of this what's his name?" queried Lees, who had assumed the role of examiner. "Jouret? Very little. He is some sort of a circus man or showman, or was before he retired. He once had wealth, but my husband, some weeks ago, said that because of ill-advised investments he was not so well rated as formerly. I had the feeling that he might be forced to give up the place. I just felt that. I never heard it. I am so sorry because of the daughter. She is a beautiful girl, and seemed kindly the one time I saw her. She was about 12 then. I do not like to say it, but she seemed a little dazed or slow-witted, but really beautiful." Mrs. Darrow fell to smoothing out the folds in her house apron, as Lee asked: "When was the only time you saw her?" 10 years ago about. Just after my father's death. They called on us. We did not care to continue the friendship, as Jouret seemed a little flamboyant. His circus nature, I suppose. Anyway, we were quiet folks, and there was no need of close association with neighbors. I remember, continued the widow after a pause, that Jouret, when he heard my husband was a scientist, simulated an interest in science. He did have a smattering knowledge of science, but he was plainly affected, so we decided to just let him drop. No ill feeling, we were not interested. You do not approve of circus people? It's not that. Any honest work is honorable. It seems commendable to furnish amusement for the public. I know little about people of his profession, but I am sure they are perfectly all right. It was Jouret personally. He seemed noisy and insincere. The girl was nice. I loved her. That is all you know of the Jourets? That is all. Mrs. Darrow, I wish to go through this house from attic to basement. Have you any objection? None whatever. Make yourself free, but do not attach any significance to what appears to be a secret passageway and cave. My father was a biological chemist. He used to experiment much with small animals. He had a cave where he stored chemicals, and I believe you will find old chemicals stored down there now. I disturbed nothing. The widow forced a smile to her lips. Will you excuse me, she concluded. I am trying to carry on. Lees, carrying a flashlight, began a systematic search of the premises. He made his way up a winding staircase, through dust and cobwebs to the attic. He found the top story filled with trunks and bits of furniture of a previous generation. All was in order, but dust-covered and cobwebby. Someone has been here before me, he said to himself, brushing a mist of cobwebs from his coat sleeves. There is a path brushed through the spider webs. Turning his flashlight on the door, he exclaimed, and here are footprints in the dust. Well, I'll be. Then after some study he mused, of course there has been someone here. The killer of Darrow probably has been here to see what he could see. It was no great task, the doors were never locked. The footprints are of no value except to give me the size of his shoes. He measured the footprints carefully. Then he went downstairs and phoned the measurements to a local shoe dealer, asking him to give the trade size of shoes which would make such prints. They are number 9s, decided the shoe dealer. Lees then returned to resume his search in the rooms and corridors. Wonder if Jouret wears 9s, he questioned himself. But what if he does? I couldn't convict him on that score. However, it might help. Then he fell to searching through the old trunks. He found old photographs, articles of apparel, knickknacks, grandmother's and grandfather's belongings, all of them, and some children's clothes of the days when little boys wore ruffles about their necks and little girls' pantalettes reached to their ankles. Carefully each article was replaced. He made his way down to the 3rd and then the 2nd floor. Through cobwebby corridors and bedchambers he searched, but found nothing further to aid his case. In the unused rooms on the 1st floor he found an old spinning wheel, candle molds, and utensils used in cooking in the days when housewives cooked over an open fire. He did not find the secret passageway until Mrs. Darrow came to his aid. Leading from the basement was a coal chute. This chute was formed in a triangle with the point under a trap. It was man-high at the cellar opening, and its floor was a slide for fuel. It had been in use evidently quite recently. At the cellar wall of this chute, Mrs. Darrow pressed what appeared to be a knot in the old timber and pushed open a door. A dank odor issued forth as the door was opened. Lees entered the passage, and Mrs. Darrow returned upstairs. Following the underground passageway, Lees came into a cave about 14 by 14 feet in size, with a ceiling and walls of arched brick. It had evidently been built before the days of cement construction. A long bench and shelves with carboys and jars of chemicals were the only furnishings. Lees sounded all the walls, but found nothing further to interest him. Lees returned to town at the urgent call of Old Perk, who had arranged with great care to keep the appointment at 50th Street and Broadway, where the decoy package was to be left. He had snipers in nearby windows. He had detectives, dressed in the gay garb of the habitués of the neighborhood, patrolling the corner, and he and his own guard parked in an automobile against all traffic rule at the curb near the rubbish can. An office boy sauntered up to the rubbish can, threw in the decoy package, and sauntered away. A second later there was a low humming sound. The decoy package fairly jumped out of the rubbish can and disappeared in thin air. The humming sound seemed to round the corner into 50th Street. Detectives followed on the jump. The humming approached an auto at the curb, and the auto's self-starter began to function. As the police stood nearby, enough to have jumped into the auto, the whole machine, a big touring car, actually disappeared before their eyes. Consternation is a mild word when used to describe the result. All forces set to trap the extortionists gathered in a group, and in their surprise and disappointment began discussing the queer case in loud tones. A crowd was gathering which was blocking traffic. Old Perk was the first to recover from his surprise. "Get the hell out of this neighborhood," he yelled to his working forces. "All of you get down to my office." The working force dissolved, and Old Perk drove away. At Old Perk's office, shortly afterwards, a conference of the defeated forces of the law and of science was held. Old Perk stormed and raged, and the detective captain in charge fumed and fussed, but nothing came of it all. One was as powerless as another. Finally the conference adjourned. The next morning in the mail, Perkins Ferguson, president of Sheffert Engineering Corporation, received a letter carefully printed in rubber type. It read: "Thanks for the $50 bill. You cheated us by $99,950. This will never do. Don't be like that. You poor fools, you make us increase our demand. We double it. Leave $200,000 for us on your desk and leave the desk unlocked. We will get it. Every time you ignore one of our demands, one of your number will die. Better take this matter seriously. Last warning. Invisible Death." "Not another dime will they get out of me," mused Ferguson. He started opening the rest of his mail. A clerk entered and handed him a telegram. It read: "Damon Farnsworth struck down at breakfast table. Family heard humming sound as he fell from his chair. Removed to medical center. Skull reported fractured. May die. William Devins, Chief of Police, Larchmont." Ferguson wildly seized the telephone. "Get me Farnsworth house at Larchmont," he shouted to his operator. The phone was answered by Jones the butler. "This is Ferguson." An agitated voice replied: "Oh, sir, yes, sir. It's true, sir. He was bleeding at the 'ead, sir. Something hit him." "Let me talk to Mrs. Farnsworth." "They're at the hospital, sir." "One of the boys." "Both are at the hospital, sir." "Do you think he will live?" "And how could I say, sir?" Ferguson called the medical center. They permitted him to talk to a doctor and a nurse. The nurse referred him to the doctor, who said: "He is unconscious. There is a wicked fracture at the base of the brain. He was struck from the back, a club, I believe. He may die without regaining consciousness. I am hoping he will rally and that he will be all right." Ferguson ordered his car, and with Lees at his heels, jumped into the tonneau. He heard a humming sound back of him. He looked back and saw nothing. Both he and Lee were too impressed for words. "Step on it," Ferguson ordered the chauffeur. "Drive us to the medical center." At the world's largest group of hospitals, Ferguson's worst fears were confirmed. The patient was reported sinking. Ferguson, giant of Wall Street, was a low-spirited man as he drove back downtown to his office. With Lees he passed through the outer offices, buzzing with business and the click of typewriters. Not a head was raised from a desk or machine. It was a well-drilled force. Into his private sanctum he walked, or rather dragged himself, and wearily he sat down. He pushed a pile of papers from him and ran his hands over his hot brow. Blood pounded at his temples. For the first time in his life he faced a situation which was too deep for his understanding. Over and over he reviewed the uncanny events as Lees sat awaiting orders. "I cannot have them killing off my friends like that," he mused finally. He called a clerk. "Go to the bank and get $200,000 in 50s and 100s," he commanded. When the clerk returned with the money, he laid the package on his desk and left the desk open. "This might appear cowardly, but it will give us time," he said. Lees did not offer an opinion. Ferguson drew a personal note for $200,000 and sent it to the Shefford Corporation's attorneys. This amount represented a large part of Ferguson's personal assets, not involved with any company with which he was connected. He told Lees to go about his further investigations. Then he left the office and started for his home. "I'll bank my life Lees will have those crooks lined up within a week," he assured himself as he lolled into his auto, bound homeward. But his voice sounded hollow, and the blood still pounded at his temples. Reaching home, he found a call from the Western plant at Chicago. He phoned the superintendent with a foreboding that all was not well. "That you, Perk?" sounded the voice on the wire. "Yes, what's up?" "I had not intended bothering you with this, but in the light of all that has happened, I guess you had better know that one of our engineers went stark mad out here about 3 weeks ago. He was a very brainy man, but his reason snapped. He first appeared queer when he began talking of anarchy and cursing capitalists. Then one afternoon he struck a shop foreman down with a heavy wrench and rushed out of the plant. We have not seen him since. The police have been looking for him, but he is still at large." "That explains a lot of things," said old Perk. "Tell the police to keep after him. We'll look for him here. File me a complete detailed report of the incident by telegraph," he instructed. Then he asked, "How is the foreman? Badly hurt?" "He dodged. It was a glancing blow. The foreman was back to work in a week, but he is nervous and has armed himself. We have put on extra guards." "Good," commended Ferguson. "Don't hesitate to spend tolls to keep me advised of any developments." An hour and a half later, Ferguson phoned the chief clerk in his offices. "Go into my private office," he ordered, "and see if there is a package on my desk. It is a bank package." The clerk returned in a few moments. "There is no package on your desk, Mr. Ferguson." "That is all I wanted to know," said Ferguson, and hung up the receiver. Then Ferguson called up the Darrow home and tried to get in touch with Lees, but was unable to do so, as Mrs. Darrow said she had not seen him since he had been called back to the office. The reason Ferguson could not reach Lees was because Lees had decided to learn once and for all if Jouret wore No. 9 shoes. He had started for Jouret's in his own car. It was a beautiful country he was traversing, but he had no time to note that the tree branches almost met over his head, and that his way was bordered with a profusion of wild flowers, displaying a rainbow of colors. The house of Jouret, the retired circus performer, sat back far from the road, against the side of a beautiful hill, and was surrounded by poplars. The landscape was wilder and more natural than that of the Darrow place adjoining. The door was opened by a Puerto Rican boy. Lees lost no time. He said bluntly, "Tell your master that a gentleman is here to see him on very particular business." Jouret himself came back with the boy. "What is it?" he asked, smiling a welcome. "I am working on the case of the death of Mr. Darrow, your neighbor. I believed you might have seen something. I thought you might aid me." Jouret betrayed no surprise. "Come in," he said. He led the way to a large reception room and asked his visitor to be seated. He was the soul of affability. Short, husky, and florid, his eyes large, black, and staring. His hair black, quite long and curling upward at the ears. He was dressed in black, and he had the appearance of a big fat crow. "I am glad you came," he greeted his guest, "for I have far too few callers." He switched on the big electric bunch light in the center of the room, for it was dusk. "We have been told that you are a retired circus man," said Lees, in his usual frank manner. "Not exactly," said Jouret. "I traveled on the continent, finally journeying to Australia and then to the States. I crossed the country from San Francisco and settled down here. I was known as Elias the Great. I had my own company and property. It was a magic show. It was not a circus, although we did carry 2 elephants, 3 camels, some ponies, snakes and birds, and smaller animals. That's where the circus report comes from. When I retired, I sold my stock to a circus. The newspapers regarded it as funny, and one of them printed a half-page story with pictures about the public sale. It was very much exaggerated. They mentioned giraffes, hyenas, and a lot of other animals I never possessed. Odd, wasn't it, getting so much publicity after I was through needing it? However, I never in those days dodged the limelight." Jouret ended his speech with a loud and hearty guffaw. "I will call my daughter," Jouret appended. "She will be glad to meet you." He left the room. Lise had taken occasion to note the size of Jouret's feet. They were small, almost effeminate. More likely 5s or 6s than 9s. Soon Jouret returned with a girl in her early 20s. She was blonde and radiantly beautiful. Doris Jouret bowed and smiled in a perfectly friendly manner. Lise noted there was something about her eyes that made her appear dazed. Jouret monopolized the conversation, giving no one a chance to edge in a word. "This gentleman desires information in connection with the death of our neighbor, Mr. or is it Dr. Darrow. I want you to assure him, as I will, that we have seen or noted nothing that could possibly throw light on the strange case." The girl nodded, it seemed a little wearily, and Jouret was off on another conversational flight. "I too am a man of scientific attainments," he chattered. "I am a biologist, toxicologist, doctor of medicine, a geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, and somewhat of a mechanic and electrician. I have given long hours to the study of strange sciences and metaphysics to which you men give too little attention. There are sciences which transcend any of this sphere. There is a higher astronomy. I neglected to say that I am an astronomer." "Yes?" drawled Lise. "Yes," said Jouret emphatically. The girl had adopted rather a theatrical pose, which disclosed considerable of her nether charms, and said nothing at all. "When you find your man," volunteered Jouret, "you will find a madman." He said this ponderously, and with a gesture meant evidently to be impressive. "You believe a madman did it?" asked Lise, as Jouret paused, expecting a question. "Undoubtedly. It was a paranoiac with delusions of money, grandeur, and a strongly developed homicidal mania. To me that is the only sensible solution. I am quite sure that I am correct." Lise arose to go, and Jouret did not urge him to stay. He bowed Lise out, and Doris bowed with him. "She is a beautiful girl," mused Lise, once he was outside. Lise ran over in his mind the circumstances of his visit to Jouret. There was no doubt in his mind that Jouret's shoes were too small to be number 9s, and he reasoned that the fact might tend to eliminate Jouret, but he was not satisfied. "I got to get some gas," he told himself, "and then I'm going to get 2 private detectives to assist me, for I'm going right back there. For the first time in my life I am going to be a peeping Tom. There is no moon. The poplars will give us a view of all 3 floors of that house if they leave their blinds up enough, and 3 of us can watch all 3 floors at once." He phoned Ferguson that he might be busy for days, joined his pair of operatives from the detective agency, and for some time the 3 operated on a well-conceived plan. It was probably a week later that Lise rendered a report to Perkins Ferguson, which for a time proved one of the strangest documents in the weird case. It read: "You will probably think I am crazy, and for this reason I am having this report subscribed and sworn to, jointly and severally. With my 2 detectives I have seen Miss Jouret, the girl I told you about over the phone, in 3 places at one and the same time. Not once, but twice this has happened. Looking through the windows of the Jouret place at night, we saw the girl on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor of the house. We believe this due to a clever arrangement of mirrors, but figure this out. The next day she drove a car to town. We followed. She got out at one theater and entered. She did not come back, that we could see, but the car drove off. There was no chauffeur, and we thought we had discovered the driverless auto, until we looked and saw Miss Jouret still at the wheel. She got out and entered another theater. She did not come back, but the car drove off with her still at the wheel. She entered a 3rd theater after parking the car, and this time the driver's seat and the tonneau was empty. Reverse the reel, and you will see her coming out of 3 theaters and driving home. That is what happened. There must be 3 of her, all identical, but only one shows at a time. If it's some of Jouret's far-famed magic, I'll say he's some conjurer. The explanation is not yet forthcoming. We want to shadow Jouret, but he never goes anywhere. The girl has only been out one time, when she attended 3 matinees as described, believe it or not. The next night we each, the 2 detectives and I, tried to steal a march on one another, and called her up and asked her to go out. To our individual surprise she agreed in each case. To our collective surprise She kept all 3 dates on the same night. She walked through the trees in this vicinity with me. She also drove down the road in the auto with one of my detectives and went dancing with the other. She was in 3 places, miles apart, at one and the same time. We each brought her home within half an hour of the other, and we are swearing to that. Either we are all hypnotized, or else there are 3 identical Mrs. Jouret. Jouret himself treats us all wonderfully, gives us the run of his house, and tries to talk us to death. The strange document was subscribed by Lees and the 2 detectives, and was held by Ferguson pending developments. The next report from Lees read: I had a chance to prowl around the Jouret house a little while waiting for Miss Jouret to dress. I met her twice in my ramblings, and a few minutes later she met me again, this time in a different costume. I got a chance to search the woods back of Jouret's house in the evening. I found a spot where the earth had been disturbed, and dug up a pair of shoes. They were number 9s. A 4th report from him read: We found the body of the crazed engineer. He had drowned himself in a lake. This eliminates him as a murder suspect. 2 weeks passed with no new developments in the invisible death case, except for the arrival of a letter demanding $1,000,000 and threatening the life of Perkins Ferguson if the demand was ignored. It was ignored, and only served to spur Lees and his detectives on to decisive actions. They decided to rush the Jouret house and kidnap Jouret with the idea of holding him until he agreed to explain the presence of the number 9 shoes buried back of his house. A low moon hung over the poplars when Lees rang the Jouret front doorbell. One detective was guarding a side door and the other a back door. Suddenly Jouret was seen to jump from a 2nd-story window. As he did, a car driven by one of his Puerto Ricans came along the drive and he leaped into it. Lees, first to see Jouret, called to his detectives. They came running. Their car was waiting in the road. The Puerto Rican was seen to jump from the Jouret car just as it started south towards New York. Lees took up the race. Both cars had plenty of power, but the Jouret car suddenly disappeared as a low humming noise began to break the silence of the night. One of the detectives was at the wheel. Lees, as usual, was giving orders. Keep close to that hum. Never mind that you cannot see the car. It is there all right. If you can gain on it enough, drive right into it. Right-o, shouted the detective. We're wise to him now. The humming noise was taking on speed with every second. So was Lees' car. Soon Lees' car was making 60 miles an hour, with the hum just ahead and barely audible. Past traffic lights, over bridges and grade crossings, the mad chase of the Phantom continued. Wildly racing through the night, missing other cars by a breath, the big visible auto continued its pursuit of what? Careening, Lees' car rounded a curve, and above the hum just ahead they heard the shouted curses of their quarry. But he could not be seen. Lees could only see the road marked by his lights. Mile after mile the wild, uncanny chase of the Phantom continued. Soon the lights of New York could be seen in the distance. The cars were forced to slow down somewhat. Suddenly there was a thundering crash ahead. A car was twisted in a mass of tangled wreckage. Feminine and masculine shrieks blended as Lees' car piled up on the wrecked heap. A 3rd car, becoming suddenly visible, rolled over and brought up at the edge of the road. From this car emerged the limping, cursing form of Jouret. From the wreckage 3 painfully injured young men dragged and tore themselves. Then they leaped, ignoring their hurts, at the limping figure. The fight was on. Jouret was heavy and powerful, and proved an obstinate fighter, for he knew he was fighting for his life. He bit and clawed. He kicked with one uninjured leg and butted with his massive head. Lee and his detectives were fighting with no respect for the rules. Lees managed to get his 2 hands on the bull neck of Jouret, just as one detective connected a duet of blows to the man's wind. Lees' hands closed in a steely grip, and soon Jouret was limp and helpless. They held him there. An ambulance arrived. A few minutes later, a police auto with reserves came on the scene. The police shackled Jouret. The car that had been hit by the Phantom was a light sedan. It was occupied by 2 women. Their bodies were drawn from the wreckage. Both were dead, innocent sacrificed to the blood madness of a maniac. Jouret was right about himself. He was a paranoiac with a strongly developed homicidal mania. In the wreckage was found a package containing $200,000 and also 2 twisted and broken mechanisms. One of these was about the size of an ordinary kitchen coffee mill, and the other slightly larger. Regarding these machines, Lees wrote in a report: "While making a fourth search of Darrow's laboratory, I found the equations, specifications, and what I believe to be the full plans for the last invention of the ingenious Darius Darrow." Many of the most astounding inventions and discoveries have resulted from theories which were laughed to scorn at the time they were advanced. Roebling's plans for the Brooklyn Bridge resulted in a meeting of the foremost engineers of the day. All agreed that the plans were built on a false premise. They argued that the bridge would fall of its own weight. Then they all had a good laugh. The bridge still stands. Watching smoke float over a hill from army campfires caused an early French scientist to dream of filling a bag full of smoke and riding with it over the hill. The first balloon was the answer to this dream. James Watt is said to have gotten his idea for a steam engine from watching a lid on a tea kettle dance under steam pressure. When Langley was flying his man-carrying kites, the Wright brothers dreamed of hitching an engine and a propeller to a giant kite. The airplane was the result of these experiments. Darrow got his idea from watching a rapidly revolving wheel. He noticed that the spokes and rim blended into a blurred disc when a certain speed was reached. The entire wheel was practically invisible under certain lighting conditions when a higher speed was attained. Darrow went further and reached the conclusion that there was a rate of vibration that would produce invisibility. This was accepted in practically all engineering research plants long before it was perfected by Darrow. The facts are that any rapidly vibrating object becomes more and more difficult to outline as its rate of vibration increases. All that was left for Darrow was to arrive at the exact mathematical time, tone, or rate of vibration producing invisibility, and to construct a vibrator tuned to produce this condition. His first machine produced the vibrations of invisibility in a field with a 3-foot radius in all directions. That is, it caused every solid object within this atmospheric field to vibrate at the rate, tone, or speed of invisibility. This machine was in no sense rotary. It departed from the original example of a revolving wheel and entered instead into general vibration in a given or measured field. The pulsations or vibrations of an ordinary automobile engine will cause every ounce of metal or solid in the automobile, including the driver, to vibrate at the same rate or momentum. This is a known fact, and it provided the basis for Darrow's experiments. Darrow built 2 machines. The first had a field with a radius of 3 feet on all sides. This was used by the killer in his murders. Jaurès stole this machine first, thus paving his way for the second robbery. With the first machine in his possession, Jaurès was able to commit the Darrow murder without being seen. He had to have the second and larger machine, however, to make his auto disappear. He stole the larger machine at the time of the Darrow murder, and with it he had his auto vanish, as the gardener testified. Both machines were hopelessly smashed in the wreck, but with Darrow's documents at hand, we might be able to construct another and a larger model. A machine built on the proper scale will make a plane or a battleship invisible, and should, as Darrow said, make war against this country impossible. Digging into Jaurès' history, we found that the Misses Jaurès were one-cell triplets. Their mother, Mrs. Doris Nettleton, an Englishwoman, was a member of Jaurès' troupe, as was the father. The mother died at the birth of the triplets. The father died a few years later. The company was touring Australia at that time. Jaurès and the father had the birth of only one baby recorded. She was named Doris after the mother. The other girls also used this one name. They now have only one name among them until the court gives them individual names. Jaurès never let but one girl be seen at a time. The reason was that he and the father had planned to use the girls, when grown, to create a surprising stage illusion. In this illusion, one girl was to act as the earthly body, and the other girls as the astral bodies of the same purported individual. The father died, and Jouret retired before he ever got around to staging the illusion. Jouret continued the deception, however, because it appealed to his showman's nature. The girls at all times were under the hypnotic control of Jouret, and of course knew nothing of his crazed intellect or crimes. Upon his arrest, Jouret released the girls from the spell of years. The Misses Nettleton say that Jouret was always kind to them, and was an ethical showman until his mind gave way. I told the triplets that I might find them employment with our concern, but they prefer to follow in the footsteps of their mother and father and return to the stage. Ferguson, quite his normal self once more, since Farnsworth was recovering slowly, twitted Lise about being in love with one of the triplets. Lise admitted they were most gorgeous blondes, but insisted he preferred one brunette. Then another thing, added Lise. Any man who falls in love with one of the Nettleton triplets will never be sure just which one he fell in love with. End of Invisible Death. Recording by Alan Winterrowd. Audio.boomcoach.com. End of Astounding Stories, January 1930.